Have you ever wondered what happens when love becomes the foundation for protecting a nation's soul? When a marriage built on shared dreams transforms into the ultimate act of patriotic sacrifice? When the walls of America's grandest home become the secret fortress protecting our most precious cultural treasures? Tonight, I'm going to take you inside one of the most extraordinary untold stories of World War II. A tale that reveals how a love story that began on the deck of an ocean liner in 1897 would ultimately save some of America's greatest artistic masterpieces from the ravages of war. This isn't just another war story. This is the remarkable account of how Biltmore Estate, built as a testament to love and beauty, became America's most secret wartime fortress. What I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you think you know about duty, sacrifice, and what it truly means to serve your country when everything you hold dear hangs in the balance. Because buried in the archives of both the National Gallery of Art and the Biltmore Estate lies documentation of an operation so classified, so dangerous, and so essential that it remained hidden from the American public for years. This is the story of George and Edith Vanderbilt, whose marriage created more than just a magnificent home. It established a legacy of service that would prove crucial when America faced its darkest hour. This is the story of David Finley, the first director of the National Gallery of Art, whose friendship with Edith Vanderbilt led to one of the most audacious cultural preservation efforts in human history. And this is the story of how a palace built for love became the secret sanctuary that protected the very soul of American culture. Before we dive into this incredible journey, let me tell you why this story matters more than you might think. This isn't just about art or architecture or even war. This is about the invisible threads that connect love, duty, and sacrifice. It's about how personal relationships become the foundation for national service. It's about the choices we make when everything we've built is threatened by forces beyond our control. I've spent months researching this extraordinary tale, diving deep into archived letters, military records, and testimonies that have been preserved for over 80 years. What I discovered will shake you to your core, because this story proves that sometimes the greatest acts of patriotism happen not on battlefields, but in quiet moments when ordinary people choose to risk everything they hold sacred for the sake of something greater than themselves. Picture this. It's December 1897, and the luxury ocean liner SS St. Paul cuts through the Atlantic waves, carrying passengers toward England, Egypt, and India. Among those passengers is George Washington Vanderbilt II, a 35-year-old bachelor whose wealth and position have made him one of America's most eligible men. But George isn't interested in the usual pursuits of Gilded Age society. He's a scholar, a bibliophile, a man who values intellect over ostentation and substance over spectacle. Also aboard this ship is Edith Stuyvesant Dresser, a woman whose intelligence and grace would soon capture the heart of the man who would build America's largest private home. Their meeting wasn't orchestrated by society matchmakers or arranged by ambitious families. It was the result of pure chance, two souls finding each other in the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. George's friend William Osgood Field would later write about that fateful voyage, describing how he watched his companion fall under the spell of the remarkable woman who shared their evening conversations. They spent their time reading books aloud to each other, playing cards, and engaging in the kind of intellectual discourse that revealed the depth of character beneath their refined exteriors. Field observed with growing amazement that his usually reserved friend was completely smitten. This wasn't the typical romance of the Gilded Age, built on social advancement or financial consolidation. This was something far more powerful and enduring. George and Edith discovered in each other kindred spirits who shared a love of learning, a passion for travel, and most importantly, a deep understanding that privilege came with responsibility to serve others. Their courtship continued across continents and through correspondence that revealed two minds perfectly matched in their values and aspirations. George wrote to Edith about his dreams for the estate he was building in the mountains of North Carolina, describing not just a magnificent house, but a vision of what their life together could become. A place where beauty and learning could flourish, where community service could take root, where their love could create something lasting and meaningful. Edith responded with equal passion about her own hopes for using wealth and position to benefit others, particularly through education and community development. She shared George's belief that their privileged circumstances came with obligations to lift up those around them. Their letters revealed two people falling in love not just with each other, but with the possibility of what they could accomplish together. The wedding that followed was as remarkable for what it wasn't as for what it was. On June 1, 1898, in a simple town hall ceremony in Paris, France, George and Edith exchanged vows in what one newspaper described as the most unostentatious Vanderbilt wedding since the family had made its fortune. There was no grand cathedral, no elaborate reception, no society photographers documenting every moment for the gossip pages. Instead, there was quiet contentment, genuine affection, and an altogether marked absence of display. The couple had chosen authenticity over spectacle, intimacy over grandeur. This choice revealed everything about the values that would guide their marriage and ultimately make possible their extraordinary service to their country during its greatest crisis. Following their Parisian wedding, the newlyweds retreated to a peaceful villa near Lake Maggiore in Italy, where they spent the summer exploring alpine scenery and visiting some of Europe's finest museums and galleries. This honeymoon wasn't about luxury resorts or fashionable destinations. It was about two people sharing their passion for art, culture, and natural beauty while building the foundation of a partnership that would endure for decades. It wasn't until after this extended European sojourn that Edith first laid eyes on Biltmore, the magnificent estate that George had been building in the mountains of North Carolina. The house that would become her home represented everything about George's character and vision. It was grand beyond imagination, yet designed with purpose and meaning rather than mere ostentation. The estate workers lined the approach road to welcome their new mistress, creating a giant horseshoe of goldenrod flowers with the phrase, "Welcome home," to greet the couple as they arrived. This warm reception reflected the genuine affection that George had earned through his fair treatment and generous policies toward those who worked for him. He had built not just a house, but a community based on mutual respect and shared purpose. The birth of their daughter Cornelia on August 22, 1900, transformed Biltmore from a magnificent house into a true home. Local newspapers celebrated the arrival of this new star at famous Biltmore, noting how the charming mistress of this gorgeous home smiled upon her firstborn. The world shared in her newfound happiness, recognizing that something special was taking root in the mountains of North Carolina. But George and Edith Vanderbilt weren't content to live in isolated splendor, no matter how beautiful their surroundings. Their love for each other had awakened an even deeper love for their community and their country. They understood that their extraordinary privilege came with extraordinary responsibility to serve others. They established schools throughout the mountains of Appalachia, bringing education to families who had never imagined such opportunities for their children. George helped create the Biltmore Forest School, America's first institute for scientific forestry, while Edith started programs to teach young women essential life skills. They bankrolled Biltmore Industries, a textile company that employed local workers and taught valuable skills like weaving and woodworking. Their charitable work extended far beyond formal organizations. Edith personally delivered food and medicine to estate workers' families when needed, bringing gifts when babies were born and comfort when loved ones were lost. She was known to ride on horseback through mountain trails to deliver wool and other necessities to isolated families struggling to survive in harsh conditions. George and Edith didn't perform these acts of service for publicity or recognition, They did it because it was the right thing to do, without seeking credit or acknowledgement. This pattern of quiet service and genuine care for others established relationships and trust that would prove essential when their country faced its greatest crisis. The vast scale and sophisticated infrastructure of Biltmore made it uniquely suited for extraordinary purposes. The main house itself was a marvel of engineering and construction, built with the finest materials and most advanced technologies available at the time. A woodworking factory and brick kiln were constructed on site, while a 3-mile railroad spur brought materials directly to the building location. Construction required the labor of approximately 1,000 workers and 60 stonemasons working with limestone, brick, and steel to create what was essentially a fireproof palace. George made extensive trips overseas during construction to purchase thousands of furnishings, including tapestries, carpets, and decorative objects dating from the 15th century to the late 19th century. The house that emerged from these efforts was the largest privately owned residence in the United States, with over 178,000 square feet of floor space and 135,000 square feet of living area. But more than its size, the house represented a commitment to preserving and celebrating the highest achievements of human culture and artistry. Little did George and Edith know that the home they had built as a testament to love and beauty would one day become America's most secret fortress, protecting the nation's greatest artistic treasures during its darkest hour. Their love story was about to become something far greater than a personal romance. It was about to become the foundation for one of the most extraordinary acts of patriotic service in American history. The stage was being set for a drama that would test everything George and Edith Vanderbilt had built together, everything they believed about duty and sacrifice, everything they understood about the relationship between private happiness and public service. Their love had created something magnificent. Soon, the world would discover whether that love was strong enough to risk everything in service of their country's survival. The year 1914 brought tragedy that would reshape the Vanderbilt family forever. George Washington. Vanderbilt II, at just 51 years old, died suddenly from complications following an appendectomy. In an instant, Edith found herself a widow, with a 14-year-old daughter, and the enormous responsibility of maintaining the vast estate that had been their shared dream. The loss devastated Edith in ways that those closest to her could barely comprehend. She had lost not just a husband, but her intellectual partner, her fellow dreamer, her companion in service to their community. The man who had shared her vision of using wealth for the betterment of others was gone, leaving her to carry forward their mission alone. But grief, rather than breaking Edith's spirit, seemed to strengthen her resolve. She understood that George's death meant she now bore the full weight of their shared responsibilities. The estate employees who had welcomed her with such warmth 20 years earlier now looked to her for leadership. The mountain families they had served together still needed education and support. The legacy they had built together required her steady hand to guide it forward. Edith threw herself into the work with a determination that amazed those around her. She expanded the educational programs they had started, increased support for local families, and maintained the estate as a beacon of cultural sophistication in the remote mountains of North Carolina. She opened Biltmore House to public tours, believing that the beauty and artistry George had assembled should be shared with visitors from around the world. The decision to open their home to the public revealed something profound about Edith's character. She could have retreated into private grief, closing the estate to outsiders and living quietly among her memories. Instead, she chose to honor George's legacy by making Biltmore a place where people could experience the highest achievements of human culture and artistry. Visitors came from across the country to walk through the magnificent rooms, to see the priceless tapestries and paintings that George had collected during his travels, to experience the gardens and grounds that had been designed as earthly paradise. Edith greeted many of these guests personally, sharing stories about the estate's creation and her husband's vision for what it could become. Among those visitors was a young man named David Finley, who would later become one of the most important figures in American cultural preservation. Finley was immediately struck not just by the magnificence of Biltmore, but by Edith's deep knowledge of art and her genuine passion for sharing that knowledge with others. Their friendship began over discussions of the Italian Renaissance paintings that graced the walls of Biltmore House. Finley was pursuing advanced studies in art history, while Edith had lived surrounded by masterpieces for decades. She had learned about each piece from George, who had personally selected every painting, sculpture, and decorative object during their travels together. As their friendship deepened over the years, Finley came to understand that Edith represented something rare in American society. She possessed not just wealth and position, but genuine expertise in matters of art and culture. More importantly, she had demonstrated through her stewardship of Biltmore that she understood the responsibility that came with being a guardian of cultural treasures. Finley's career in cultural preservation was taking shape during these same years. He worked his way up through various government positions, always focused on protecting and promoting American arts and culture. His expertise and dedication eventually led to his appointment as the first director of the National Gallery of Art when that institution opened its doors in Washington. The gallery's opening in March 1941 represented the culmination of decades of effort to create a world-class repository for artistic masterpieces in the nation's capital. Andrew Mellon's extraordinary gift of funds and artworks had made the museum possible, but it fell to Finley to transform that vision into reality. Standing in the magnificent galleries on opening day, surrounded by paintings by Rembrandt, Raphael, Vermeer, and countless other masters, Finley felt the weight of responsibility that came with protecting such irreplaceable treasures. Each work represented not just monetary value, but centuries of human achievement in capturing beauty, truth, and meaning through artistic expression. But even as he celebrated the gallery's successful opening, Finley couldn't ignore the ominous events unfolding across the Atlantic. War had already consumed much of Europe, and reports reaching Washington painted a terrifying picture of cultural destruction accompanying military conquest. Nazi forces had systematically looted artwork from occupied territories, stripping museums and private collections of their greatest treasures. In some cases, pieces that had survived for centuries were destroyed simply because they didn't align with Nazi ideology about acceptable art. The systematic destruction of Jewish-owned collections was particularly horrifying, representing not just theft, but cultural genocide. London, America's closest ally, was enduring nightly bombing raids that left historic buildings in ruins and cultural institutions damaged or destroyed. If the British capital, with all its defenses and preparations, could suffer such devastation, what would prevent similar attacks on Washington if America entered the war? Finley found himself lying awake at night, imagining scenarios that made his blood run cold. What if Nazi submarines managed to shell the American coast? What if enemy aircraft somehow reached Washington and targeted the symbols of American democracy? The Capitol, the White House, and the National Gallery were all located within a small area that could be devastated by a single, successful attack. The proximity of these fears became starkly real just 2 days after the gallery's opening, when London suffered one of its worst bombing raids of the entire war. The timing felt like a cosmic warning about the vulnerability of cultural institutions during wartime. Finley began developing contingency plans almost immediately. His first step was to consult with security experts and military advisors about the realistic threats facing Washington. Their assessments were sobering. While a full-scale invasion seemed unlikely, the possibility of bombing raids or sabotage attacks could not be dismissed. Enemy agents were already known to be operating within the United States, and the capital represented the most valuable target in the country. The experts recommended dispersing the gallery's most valuable pieces to secure locations far from Washington, preferably in areas that would be unlikely targets for enemy action. But finding suitable locations presented enormous challenges. The artworks required climate-controlled environments, sophisticated security measures, and complete protection from fire, flood, and other natural disasters. Most critically, any location used for such purposes would need to maintain absolute secrecy. If enemy agents discovered where America's greatest artistic treasures were hidden, those locations would immediately become priority targets for attack. The entire operation would need to be conducted with the kind of operational security typically reserved for the most classified military activities. As Finley wrestled with these seemingly impossible requirements, his thoughts kept returning to a conversation he'd had with Edith Vanderbilt during one of his visits to Biltmore. She had mentioned the unique construction features of the house, particularly its fireproof design and remote location in the mountains of North Carolina. The more he considered it, the more perfect Biltmore seemed for his purposes. The house was built like a fortress, with limestone walls and steel construction that would resist both fire and attack. Its location deep in the Appalachian Mountains made it an unlikely target for enemy action, while its distance from major cities provided additional security. Perhaps most importantly, Finley trusted Edith Vanderbilt completely. Their friendship had been built over years of shared conversations about art, culture, and the responsibility of preserving beauty for future generations. He knew that she understood the gravity of what he was contemplating, and that her patriotism ran as deep as her love for the arts. The decision to approach Edith about using Biltmore as a wartime repository represented a convergence of friendship, practical necessity, and absolute trust. Finley knew he was asking his friend to risk everything she held dear for the sake of protecting America's cultural heritage. The estate that had been her home, her refuge, and her life's work would become a target if the secret operation were ever discovered. But he also knew that if anyone would understand the importance of such sacrifice, it would be the woman who had already demonstrated her commitment to service through decades of quiet work in her mountain community. Edith Vanderbilt had spent her entire adult life understanding that privilege came with responsibility. Now Finley was about to ask her to prove that understanding in the most dramatic way possible. The conversation that would determine the fate of America's greatest artistic treasures was about to take place between two friends who shared a deep love of culture and an even deeper love of country. What happened next would transform a love story that began on an ocean liner into one of the most extraordinary acts of patriotic service in American history. Service in American history. The telephone call that would change everything came on a crisp autumn morning in 1941. David Finley sat in his office at the National Gallery, staring out at the Washington skyline while wrestling with a decision that kept him awake at night. The reports from Europe grew more terrifying each day. Paris had fallen. London burned nightly under German bombs, and somewhere across the Atlantic, Nazi forces were systematically destroying or stealing every piece of art they could find. Finley picked up the phone with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what he was about to ask. The number he dialed connected him to Biltmore Estate, to a woman who had become one of his dearest friends over the years, to someone whose judgment and character he trusted more than anyone else in the world. When Edith Vanderbilt's familiar voice came through the receiver, Finley found himself struggling to find the right words. How do you ask someone to risk everything they hold sacred? How do you explain that the very survival of American culture might depend on their willingness to transform their beloved home into a fortress? "Edith," he began, his voice carrying the weight of urgent necessity, "I need to ask you something that might sound impossible. If our country goes to war, would you consider allowing us to bring some of the nation's most precious artworks to Biltmore for safekeeping?" The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but to Finley it felt like an eternity. He was asking her to turn the house where she had raised her daughter, where she had built a life with George, where every room held memories of their shared dreams, into a potential target for enemy action. Edith's response came without hesitation, clear and firm and absolutely certain. "Of course, David. Whatever our country needs." Those 6 words changed the course of American cultural history. In that moment, A widow who had already sacrificed so much chose to risk everything she had left for the sake of protecting treasures that belonged not to her, but to all Americans. Her immediate agreement revealed the depth of her patriotism and her understanding of what was truly at stake. But Edith's willingness to help was only the beginning of an enormously complex undertaking. Finley hung up the phone knowing that he had secured the perfect location for his secret operation, but also knowing that the challenges ahead would test every aspect of their friendship and their shared commitment to preserving American culture. The first step was conducting a thorough security assessment of Biltmore itself. Finley dispatched a team of specialists to North Carolina under the cover of routine museum consultations. These experts examined every aspect of the estate, from its structural integrity to its fire suppression systems, from its remote location to the reliability of local law enforcement. Their report exceeded even Finley's most optimistic expectations. Biltmore House was essentially a fireproof fortress, built with limestone walls and steel construction that would resist almost any conceivable threat. The estate's location deep in the Appalachian Mountains made it nearly impossible to attack without extensive advance warning. Most importantly, the house contained rooms that could be easily modified for secure storage without compromising the building's structural integrity. The music room emerged as the perfect location for their purposes. This unfinished space with brick walls and pine flooring was already excluded from public tours, making it ideal for conversion into a secure vault. The room's position within the house provided multiple layers of protection, while its size would accommodate the artworks they needed to relocate. Converting the music room into a fortress within a fortress required extraordinary secrecy and precision. Workers arrived at Biltmore under various pretexts, ostensibly making routine maintenance and improvements to the estate. In reality, they were installing steel-vaulted doors in the archways and steel bars over the windows, creating an impenetrable sanctuary within the elegant confines of the Vanderbilt mansion. The steel doors were carefully concealed behind tapestries that matched the room's existing decor, ensuring that visitors could walk past without suspecting what lay hidden behind those delicate folds. Fire extinguishers and alarm systems were discreetly installed, while steel racks were constructed to properly support the paintings that would soon call this room home. Throughout this preparation phase, Edith Vanderbilt maintained her regular schedule of activities, greeting visitors, overseeing estate operations, and participating in her various community service projects. No one suspected that America's greatest private residence was being transformed into the nation's most secret cultural fortress. The selection of which artworks to relocate proved almost as challenging as preparing their destination. Finley and his team faced the agonizing task of choosing which pieces were too valuable to risk leaving in Washington. Every painting, every sculpture in the National Gallery's collection represented irreplaceable cultural heritage, but practical limitations meant they could only protect a fraction of their holdings. The final list read like a roster of human artistic achievement. Gilbert Stuart's iconic portrait of George Washington, the image that graced currency and classrooms across America, would make the journey to North Carolina. Raphael's masterpieces, including his portrait of Bindo Altoviti, were deemed too precious to remain in the capital. Works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Van Dyck, Goya, and Titian joined the WWII collection destined for secret exile in the mountains. Each piece carried not just monetary value, but symbolic importance that went to the heart of American identity and values. These were the works that defined civilization itself, the artistic achievements that proved humanity's capacity for creating beauty even in the darkest times. Protecting them meant preserving the very soul of American culture for future generations. The logistics of transporting such priceless cargo presented challenges that would have daunted military strategists. Each artwork required special crating designed to protect against shock, vibration, temperature changes, and humidity fluctuations. The crates themselves had to be unmarked and unremarkable, giving no indication of their precious contents to casual observers. Security arrangements involved multiple layers of protection and deception. The artworks would travel by rail, the most secure form of long-distance transportation available, but their route and timing would be classified at the highest levels. Armed guards would accompany the shipment, but they would be dressed as ordinary railroad employees to avoid drawing attention. The timing of the operation was dictated by events beyond anyone's control. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, transformed theoretical preparations into urgent necessity. America was now at war, and the capital city had become a potential target for enemy action. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, Finley's carefully laid plans swung into motion with the precision of a military operation. On a cold January night in 1942, as snow began falling across the eastern United States, 62 paintings and 17 sculptures were loaded aboard a specially equipped train car in Washington's Union Station. The train that departed into the winter darkness carried more than artwork. It carried the distilled essence of human creativity, the accumulated wisdom of centuries of artistic achievement, the cultural foundation upon which American civilization rested. Every mile of track brought these treasures closer to safety, but also deeper into the unknown risks of a secret operation unprecedented in American history. Edith Vanderbilt waited at Biltmore as the train made its way through the Virginia countryside and into the foothills of North Carolina. She understood that in a matter of hours, her peaceful mountain estate would become one of the most heavily guarded locations in the entire country. Armed sentries would patrol her garden, steel doors would seal off sections of her home, and the house where she had found such happiness would become a fortress protecting America's greatest artistic treasures. The woman who had opened her home to thousands of visitors was about to close it to all but a select few who possessed the highest security clearances. The estate that had been built as a celebration of beauty and culture was about to become a vault where that same beauty and culture would hide from a world gone mad with war. As snow continued to fall across the mountains of western North Carolina, Edith stood at her window watching the empty approach road and thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had married for love, lost her husband too soon, and spent decades honoring his memory through service to their community. Now she was being asked to risk everything they had built together for the sake of something even greater than their personal happiness. The train carrying America's artistic soul was approaching through the winter storm, and with it would come the ultimate test of whether love could indeed become the foundation for protecting a nation's most precious treasures. The love story that began on an ocean liner 45 years earlier was about to reach its most dramatic and dangerous chapter. The convoy that wound its way through the treacherous mountain roads that January night in 1942 carried more than precious cargo. It carried the weight of American cultural identity through conditions that would have challenged even the most experienced drivers under normal circumstances. The snow fell with relentless intensity, transforming familiar landmarks into alien shapes and making every turn of the winding approach road a test of nerves and skill. David Finley rode in the lead vehicle, his hands gripping the door handle as the truck navigated the icy curves that climbed toward Biltmore House. Behind him, specially equipped vehicles carried crates containing some of the most valuable objects in human history, each one wrapped in protective materials and secured against the jolting motion of the treacherous journey. The approach road that had once welcomed wedding guests and society visitors now served as the final leg of one of the most dangerous art transport operations ever attempted. Every pothole threatened disaster. Every steep grade risked catastrophic failure. Every icy patch could send millions of dollars worth of irreplaceable masterpieces tumbling down the mountainside. Finley found himself sweating despite the bitter cold, his imagination conjuring horrific scenarios of Raphael's Alba Madonna sliding from its moorings, of Vermeer's delicate brushwork being shattered by a single moment of mechanical failure. The responsibility he carried felt heavier than the physical weight of the artworks themselves. These weren't just paintings and sculptures. They were the visual DNA of Western civilization, the accumulated genius of centuries of human creativity. The estate workers who had been secretly briefed about the operation waited in the darkness near the house, their faces grim with understanding of what was at stake. They had been sworn to absolute secrecy, knowing that a single careless word could transform their peaceful mountain home into a target for enemy sabotage. These were people who had served the Vanderbilt family for decades, whose loyalty had been earned through years of fair treatment and mutual respect. As the convoy finally reached the circular drive in front of Biltmore House, Edith Vanderbilt emerged from the main entrance with a composure that masked the anxiety she felt watching this dangerous operation unfold at her doorstep. She had spent the evening pacing through rooms that would soon house treasures she had only seen hanging in distant museums, wondering whether she was making the right choice in risking everything her family had built. The unloading process began immediately, despite the continuing snowfall and the late hour. Each crate was handled with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, carried by teams of specially trained handlers who understood that a single slip could destroy something that had survived for centuries. The snow muffled their footsteps as they moved through the ornate halls of Biltmore House, transforming the elegant mansion into something resembling a midnight funeral procession. The music room, with its newly installed steel doors and concealed security measures, received its first residents in an atmosphere of hushed solemnity. As each crate was carefully positioned on the specially constructed racks, the room gradually transformed from an empty space into a treasure vault that contained more artistic wealth than most museums could dream of possessing. Gilbert Stuart's George Washington portrait, the face that had gazed from classroom walls and government buildings across America for generations, found itself sharing space with Titian's Venus with a mirror, a masterpiece that had adorned European palaces for centuries before making its way to American shores. The juxtaposition seemed to symbolize everything that was at stake in this war. American democratic ideals standing alongside the artistic achievements of the old world they were fighting to preserve. Raphael's Bindo Altoviti, painted during the height of the Italian Renaissance, was positioned near works by Rembrandt that captured the golden age of Dutch culture. These pieces represented not just individual artistic achievement, but entire civilizations at their creative peaks. Protecting them meant preserving humanity's greatest accomplishments for whatever world would emerge from the current chaos. The installation of round-the-clock security began immediately after the last artwork was safely positioned. Armed guards took their posts at strategic locations throughout the estate, their presence carefully disguised to maintain the illusion that Biltmore remained nothing more than a tourist attraction and private residence. Visitors who arrived during daylight hours would see uniformed security personnel, but they would assume these guards were simply estate employees protecting the Vanderbilt family's property. The deception required extraordinary coordination between multiple agencies and individuals. Federal security services provided the armed guards and sophisticated surveillance equipment, while estate staff maintained their normal routines to avoid arousing suspicion. Local law enforcement received carefully crafted explanations for the increased activity, stories that contained just enough truth to be believable without revealing the operation's true nature. Edith Vanderbilt found herself living a double life that would have challenged the most experienced intelligence operative. During daylight hours, she continued her role as gracious hostess and community leader, greeting visitors with the same warmth she had always shown while carefully steering conversations away from topics that might lead to uncomfortable questions. Her decades of experience in society had taught her the art of revealing nothing while appearing to share everything. The psychological strain of maintaining such an elaborate deception began to take its toll on everyone involved in the operation. Finley made regular visits to Biltmore under various pretexts, officially consulting on museum matters while actually checking on the security and condition of the hidden artworks. Each visit required him to balance his genuine concern for the collection with the need to maintain absolute secrecy about his true purpose. The estate staff who were aware of the operation found themselves constantly vigilant for signs that their secret might be discovered. Every visitor was scrutinized, every conversation monitored for hints that someone might suspect what was hidden behind those concealed steel doors. The weight of protecting such an enormous secret created bonds among the conspirators that went far beyond their professional relationships. Meanwhile, the artworks themselves settled into their mountain exile with the silent patience that only inanimate objects can possess. The climate-controlled environment maintained perfect conditions for their preservation, while the sophisticated fire suppression system stood ready to protect them from the threat that had destroyed so many cultural treasures throughout history. The irony was not lost on anyone involved that these masterpieces, created to be seen and admired by the public, now hid in darkness behind steel doors and armed guards. Paintings that had hung in the palaces of kings and the galleries of great museums now waited in secret for a world safe enough to display them openly again. The success of the operation's first phase brought relief mixed with growing awareness that their real challenges were just beginning. Keeping the artwork safe during transport had been difficult enough, but maintaining their security for an indefinite period while preserving absolute secrecy would require sustained vigilance and flawless execution by everyone involved. Reports from the war front reinforced the wisdom of their precautions. Nazi forces continued their systematic destruction and theft of cultural treasures across occupied Europe, while American cities began implementing blackout procedures and air raid drills. The possibility that Washington itself might face bombing attacks no longer seemed like paranoid fantasy, but realistic preparation for probable events. The National Gallery in Washington continued operating with its remaining collection, but staff members found themselves constantly aware of the empty spaces where their greatest treasures had once hung. Visitors continued to arrive, unaware that they were seeing only a fraction of the museum's holdings, while guards and curators shared the burden of knowing where the missing masterpieces had gone. Back at Biltmore, the rhythm of daily life gradually adapted to accommodate the extraordinary circumstances that now defined the estate's existence. Tour guides learned to navigate around restricted areas without drawing attention to the changes, while maintenance staff incorporated additional security checks into their normal routines. The elaborate dance of deception became so practiced that it appeared completely natural to outside observers. Edith Vanderbilt discovered reserves of strength she had never known she possessed as she balanced the demands of maintaining normal operations with the stress of protecting America's greatest cultural treasures. Her morning routine now included security briefings that would have been classified at the highest government levels, while her afternoon tea conversations required constant vigilance to avoid revealing anything about the secrets hidden within her home. The transformation of Biltmore from private residence to national fortress represented something unprecedented in American history. Never before had a private citizen been asked to risk their family's legacy for the sake of protecting the nation's cultural heritage. Never before had the intimate spaces of a personal home been converted into a high-security vault for treasures belonging to all Americans. As winter gradually gave way to spring in the mountains of North Carolina, the success of the Biltmore operation became increasingly apparent. The artworks remained safe and secure while the secret of their location stayed perfectly protected. But everyone involved understood that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. As the war intensified and the risks to America's homeland grew more serious with each passing month. The love story that had begun with George and Edith's meeting on an ocean liner had evolved into something far greater than personal romance. It had become a testament to the power of private virtue to serve public necessity, of individual sacrifice to preserve collective heritage, of love to create something strong enough to protect the very soul of American civilization during its darkest hour. The months that followed brought challenges that tested every aspect of the elaborate deception that had transformed Biltmore into America's most secret cultural fortress. As spring arrived in the mountains of North Carolina, the estate faced its first major crisis, when a routine inspection by state fire officials threatened to expose the entire operation. The fire marshal who arrived that warm April morning had no idea that he was about to walk through a building containing more artistic wealth than most European museums. His visit was prompted by new wartime regulations requiring enhanced safety measures at all public facilities, a perfectly reasonable request that sent waves of panic through everyone who knew what was really hidden behind those concealed steel doors. Edith Vanderbilt met the inspector with the same gracious hospitality she had always shown official visitors, guiding him through the public areas of the house while carefully avoiding any route that might lead near the music room. Her decades of experience as a hostess served her well as she engaged him in conversations about the estate's history and architecture, drawing his attention to the magnificent rooms that tourists regularly admired while steering him away from areas that could expose their secret. The inspection proceeded smoothly until the fire marshal noticed discrepancies in the building's floor plan that suggested spaces were being used differently than originally intended. His trained eye detected the subtle signs of recent modifications, the barely visible evidence of construction work that had transformed ordinary rooms into something far more secure and sophisticated. David Finley received an urgent telephone call that afternoon, his heart racing as Edith described the inspector's questions and his growing suspicion that something unusual was happening at Biltmore. The success of their entire operation hung in the balance as they worked frantically to develop plausible explanations for the modifications that had been discovered. The solution came through the estate's established reputation for community service and wartime patriotism. They explained the security improvements as precautions designed to protect the Vanderbilt family's own art collection from potential wartime threats, a story that contained enough truth to be completely believable. The fire marshal accepted their explanations and approved the enhanced safety measures, never suspecting that he had just certified the security arrangements protecting America's greatest artistic treasures. The close call reinforced everyone's understanding of how precarious their situation remained. Every visitor, every delivery, every routine interaction carried the potential for discovery and disaster. The estate staff developed increasingly sophisticated protocols for managing these risks, creating elaborate systems of signals and procedures that allowed them to respond instantly to any threat to their secret. Summer brought new challenges as tourism to the estate increased dramatically. Wartime gas rationing had made distant travel more difficult, leading many families to vacation closer to home. Biltmore's reputation as one of America's most magnificent attractions drew record crowds of visitors eager to experience a taste of luxury during increasingly austere times. The increased foot traffic required constant vigilance from security personnel, who had to maintain their cover while watching for any signs of suspicious behavior. Every photographer had to be monitored to ensure they didn't capture images of restricted areas. Every curious guest who wandered from the designated tour route had to be gently redirected without creating the impression that anything was being hidden. Edith found herself serving as the primary guardian of their secret, her presence at the estate providing the perfect cover for the enhanced security measures. Visitors expected to see guards protecting the valuable Vanderbilt collection, making the armed personnel seem like a natural precaution rather than evidence of a classified government operation. The psychological toll of maintaining such an elaborate deception for months on end began affecting everyone involved in different ways. Some of the guards struggled with the isolation of their assignment, unable to discuss their work with family or friends back home. Estate workers who had been trusted with the secret found themselves constantly anxious about accidentally revealing something that could compromise the operation. Finley made increasingly frequent visits to Biltmore, officially consulting on various museum projects while actually monitoring the condition of the hidden artworks and the morale of the people protecting them. Each trip reinforced his appreciation for the extraordinary sacrifice that Edith was making, not just in terms of the physical risk to her property, but in the emotional burden of living with such an enormous secret. The artworks themselves remained in perfect condition within their climate-controlled sanctuary, but their enforced isolation seemed to mirror the broader isolation felt by everyone involved in protecting them. These masterpieces had been created to inspire and educate, to connect people across centuries through shared appreciation of beauty and meaning. Now they waited in darkness, their power held in reserve until the world became safe enough to display them openly again. Reports from the European war front continued to justify the precautions they had taken. Nazi forces had systematically stripped the great museums of Paris, sending trainloads of stolen artwork back to Germany while destroying pieces they deemed unworthy of preservation. The fate of countless masterpieces remained unknown, their survival dependent on the courage of individuals who risked their lives to hide cultural treasures from occupying forces. The contrast between the destruction occurring across Europe and the preservation happening at Biltmore reinforced everyone's understanding of the historical significance of their mission. They were not just protecting individual artworks, but preserving the continuity of human cultural achievement. If American civilization survived this war, future generations would be able to experience these masterpieces because of the sacrifices being made in a mountain mansion in North Carolina. The autumn of 1942 brought news that transformed the entire context of their operation. Allied forces had achieved their first major victory against Nazi Germany with the success of Operation Torch in North Africa. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Americans could envision a path to eventual victory, though everyone understood that years of hard fighting still lay ahead. The changing military situation created new challenges for the Biltmore operation as government priorities shifted and resources were redirected toward supporting the expanding war effort. Finley found himself defending the continued protection of the artworks against officials who argued that the immediate threat to the American homeland had diminished sufficiently to allow their return to Washington. These debates revealed the fundamental tension between short-term military expediency and long-term cultural preservation. The war was far from over, and the possibility of devastating attacks on American cities remained very real. Japanese submarine activity off the East Coast and German spy operations within the United States demonstrated that the homeland was not immune from enemy action. Edith Vanderbilt's voice proved crucial in these discussions. Her credibility as someone who had already sacrificed enormously for the war effort giving weight to her arguments for continued vigilance. She understood better than anyone the risks involved in their operation, but she also understood that premature exposure of the artworks could prove catastrophic if the war's fortunes suddenly turned against the Allies. The winter of 1942 marked the first anniversary of the artwork's arrival at Biltmore, a milestone that prompted reflection on everything that had been accomplished and everything that still needed to be done. The secret had been kept perfectly despite countless opportunities for exposure. The artworks remained in pristine condition despite being housed in facilities never intended for such purposes. Most remarkably, the estate had continued functioning as a tourist attraction and private residence throughout this entire period, maintaining the normal rhythms of daily life while hiding one of the most important government operations in the country. Thousands of visitors had walked through the halls of Biltmore House without suspecting that they were within yards of America's greatest artistic treasures. The success of the operation had created its own form of psychological burden, as everyone involved realized they were participating in something historically unprecedented. The weight of responsibility for protecting such irreplaceable cultural heritage affected different people in different ways, but it touched everyone who knew the secret with a sense of participating in something far greater than their individual lives. Edith found herself thinking increasingly about George and what he would have thought about their home serving such an extraordinary purpose. She imagined him being proud of the way their shared vision of service had evolved into something that could protect the artistic achievements he had spent his lifetime collecting and preserving. The love story that had created Biltmore had reached its ultimate expression in this act of national service. As 1943 began, the operation that had started as an emergency measure was settling into a routine that could potentially continue for years. The war showed no signs of ending quickly, and the artworks had found a security and stability at Biltmore that exceeded anything they could have enjoyed in Washington. The mountain fortress that love had built was proving itself capable of protecting America's cultural soul through the greatest crisis in the nation's history. The story that had begun with a chance meeting on an ocean liner had become something far more significant than anyone could have imagined. Two people who had fallen in love while reading poetry together on the deck of a ship had created something strong enough to serve their country when that service required risking everything they had built together. Their legacy was being tested in ways they never could have anticipated, and it was proving equal to every challenge the world could present. The strain of maintaining absolute secrecy for over a year was beginning to show in ways that threatened the entire operation. By early 1943, the psychological pressure of living with such an enormous secret had created unexpected vulnerabilities among the estate staff who knew about the hidden treasures. Small changes in behavior, subtle signs of stress, and the gradual erosion of normal social interactions were becoming noticeable to visitors and community members who had no knowledge of what was happening behind the scenes. The most dangerous moment came when Margaret Sullivan, one of the longtime housekeeping staff who had been trusted with knowledge of the operation, began drinking heavily to cope with the anxiety of maintaining the deception. Her increasingly erratic behavior during public tours raised concerns that she might accidentally reveal something that could expose everything they had worked so hard to protect. Edith faced one of the most difficult decisions of her entire involvement in the operation when she realized that Margaret's deteriorating condition posed an unacceptable risk to national security. The woman, who had served the Vanderbilt family faithfully for over 20 years, who had helped raise Cornelia from childhood, who had been like family to everyone at the estate, now represented a potential catastrophe that could destroy America's most important cultural preservation effort. The conversation between Edith and Margaret took place in the privacy of the estate's rose garden, surrounded by blooms that George had planted decades earlier as a symbol of enduring beauty. Edith approached the subject with all the compassion she could muster, understanding that she was asking someone to leave the only home they had known for the sake of protecting secrets they could never fully understand. Margaret's response revealed the depth of loyalty that the Vanderbilt family had inspired through generations of fair treatment and genuine care for their employees. Despite her personal struggles, despite the pain of being asked to leave, she understood immediately what was at stake and agreed to relocate to a position with distant relatives in Virginia. Her sacrifice, like so many others connected to the Biltmore operation, demonstrated how individual acts of patriotism combined to protect something far greater than personal interests. The incident forced Finley and his security team to develop more sophisticated psychological support systems for the people involved in protecting the artworks. They brought in specialists who could provide counseling and stress management techniques without ever being told the true nature of what was causing the anxiety. The elaborate deceptions required to maintain operational security extended even to the mental health professionals who were helping to preserve the mental stability of the operation's participants. As spring returned to the mountains of North Carolina in 1943, the estate faced its most severe test yet when Cornelia Vanderbilt Cecil, now married and living her own life, decided to visit her childhood home for an extended stay. Her arrival created complications that no one had anticipated when the operation was first planned, as her intimate knowledge of every corner of Biltmore House made it nearly impossible to conceal the modifications that had been made. Cornelia had grown up in these rooms, had played games that involved exploring every hidden corner and secret passage in the vast mansion. Her trained eye immediately noticed the subtle changes that had been made to accommodate the hidden artworks, the slight alterations in traffic patterns during tours, the barely perceptible signs that certain areas were now off-limits in ways they had never been before. The decision about whether to bring Cornelia into the secret became a source of intense debate among the operation's leadership. Her security clearance process would take weeks to complete, during which time she would remain at the estate as a potential security risk. Yet, her growing suspicion about the changes she was observing posed an equally serious threat to the operation's continued success. Edith found herself caught between her maternal instincts to protect her daughter and her patriotic duty to protect the nation's cultural treasures. The conversation in which she finally revealed the truth to Cornelia took place in the same room where George had first shown Edith the architectural plans for their magnificent home. Now that room became the setting for passing the torch of family responsibility to the next generation. Cornelia's reaction to learning about the secret operation revealed that she had inherited both her father's appreciation for art and her mother's commitment to service. Rather than being shocked or frightened by the revelation, she immediately began thinking about ways she could contribute to protecting the hidden treasures. Her fresh perspective and intimate knowledge of the estate proved invaluable in identifying additional security measures that could be implemented without arousing suspicion. The addition of Cornelia to their inner circle of trusted individuals created new opportunities for maintaining the operation's cover while strengthening its security. Her presence at the estate provided additional justification for the enhanced protection measures, as visitors naturally assumed that extra guards were necessary to protect both the Vanderbilt family and their valuable personal collection. Summer brought unprecedented challenges as war production created severe shortages of materials needed to maintain the climate-controlled environment protecting the artworks. The sophisticated heating and cooling systems that kept the hidden treasures in perfect condition required components that were now considered essential to the military effort. Finding replacement parts without revealing why they were needed became an ongoing struggle that tested everyone's ingenuity and connections. The solution came through the estate's long-standing relationships with local craftsmen and suppliers who had worked with the Vanderbilt family for decades. These skilled artisans, many of whom had learned their trades working on the original construction of Biltmore House, proved capable of fabricating replacement components using techniques and materials that had been abandoned by modern industry. Their willingness to undertake this challenging work without asking uncomfortable questions demonstrated the deep loyalty that the Vanderbilt family had earned through generations of fair dealing and community service. The technical challenges of maintaining perfect environmental conditions in a building that had never been designed for such purposes pushed everyone involved to develop innovative solutions that would influence museum practices for decades to come. The lessons learned at Biltmore about protecting valuable artworks in non-traditional settings would eventually be applied to cultural preservation efforts around the world. As autumn arrived in 1943, reports from the European theater brought news that transformed everyone's understanding of why their mission was so crucial. Allied forces advancing through Italy had discovered the extent of Nazi art looting operations, finding warehouses filled with stolen masterpieces that had been stripped from museums and private collections across occupied Europe. The systematic nature of this cultural theft exceeded even the worst fears that had motivated the Biltmore operation. Photographs of recovered artworks that had been damaged or destroyed during their forced relocation served as stark reminders of what could have happened to America's treasures if they had remained in Washington during the height of the war. The decision to move them to safety, which had seemed like an extreme precaution when it was first implemented, now appeared to have been absolutely essential for their survival. The vindication of their efforts brought both relief and renewed determination to maintain the operation's security until the war's end. Everyone involved understood that their success had preserved not just individual artworks, but entire centuries of human creative achievement that would have been lost forever if they had been destroyed in bombing raids or captured by enemy forces. The approaching winter of 1943 marked 2 years since the artworks had arrived at Biltmore, a milestone that prompted reflection on how completely the operation had been integrated into the rhythm of daily life at the estate. The armed guards had become familiar figures to regular visitors. The restricted areas had been seamlessly incorporated into tour routes, and the elaborate deceptions had become so natural that maintaining them required little conscious effort. Yet beneath this surface, normalcy lay the constant awareness that they were participating in something historically unprecedented. The love story that had created Biltmore had evolved into a testament to the power of private virtue to serve public necessity, demonstrating how individual sacrifice could preserve collective heritage during humanity's darkest hours. Edith often stood at the windows that overlooked the gardens where she and George had once walked together, thinking about how their shared dreams had led to this moment when their home served as a fortress protecting the very essence of American culture. The flowers that bloomed each spring in those gardens seemed to symbolize the enduring power of beauty to survive even the most devastating attempts to destroy it. The artworks that waited in their hidden sanctuary represented the same triumph of human creativity over forces of destruction. They had survived centuries of wars, revolutions, and natural disasters to reach this moment when they needed protection from the greatest threat civilization had ever faced. The love that had built Biltmore was proving strong enough to shield them through this crisis, just as it had sheltered the Vanderbilt family through personal tragedies and triumphs. As 1944 began, everyone involved in the operation understood that they were entering what might be the final phase of their mission. Allied forces were preparing for the massive invasion that would open a second front in Europe, bringing the war closer to its eventual conclusion. But victory remained uncertain, and the possibility of German retaliation against American targets meant that the artworks would need to remain hidden until peace was finally achieved. The estate continued its double life with practiced efficiency, welcoming thousands of visitors who marveled at the magnificence of the Vanderbilt mansion while remaining completely unaware that they were walking through one of the most important military installations in the country. The success of this elaborate deception had become so complete that it seemed almost effortless, though everyone involved knew how much careful planning and constant vigilance were required to maintain it. The bonds forged among the people protecting America's cultural treasures had grown stronger with each passing month, creating relationships that transcended their professional obligations. They had become a family united by shared purpose and mutual dependence, understanding that the success of their mission required absolute trust and unwavering commitment from everyone involved. The love story that had begun on an ocean liner decades earlier had become the foundation for something far greater than personal happiness. It had created a legacy of service that could protect the very soul of American civilization during its greatest trial, proving that private virtue could serve public necessity in ways that changed the course of history itself. The spring of 1944 brought with it a transformation in the global conflict that would forever alter the trajectory of the Biltmore operation. Allied forces were massing in England for what everyone understood would be the decisive campaign to liberate Europe from Nazi occupation. The massive buildup of men and materials represented humanity's greatest gamble, a coordinated effort that would either crush the Nazi war machine or result in catastrophic failure that could prolong the conflict for years. David Finley found himself caught between conflicting pressures as military planners began questioning whether the resources devoted to protecting artwork might be better utilized supporting the upcoming invasion. High-ranking officials who had never fully understood the cultural significance of the Biltmore operation saw an opportunity to redeploy personnel and equipment to more obviously military purposes. The debates that ensued revealed fundamental differences in how various government leaders understood the relationship between cultural preservation and military victory. Some argued that winning the war was the only priority that mattered, while others maintained that preserving the values and achievements that made victory meaningful was equally essential to ultimate success. Edith Vanderbilt's voice proved decisive in these discussions, her credibility as someone who had already sacrificed enormously lending weight to her arguments for continued protection. She understood that premature exposure of the artworks could prove catastrophic if German forces managed to launch retaliatory attacks against American targets. Her decades of experience in managing complex social and political relationships served her well as she navigated the treacherous waters of wartime bureaucracy. The resolution came through a compromise that satisfied both military efficiency and cultural preservation concerns. The Biltmore operation would continue with slightly reduced security, but additional precautions would be implemented to prepare for potential emergency evacuation if circumstances required moving the artworks again. This decision reflected growing confidence in Allied military prospects while acknowledging that the war was far from over. The announcement of the successful invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, brought celebrations throughout the estate that had to be carefully managed to avoid revealing why this news was particularly significant to the hidden operation. Staff members who knew about the artworks understood that the opening of the Second Front marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, bringing closer the day when their precious charges could safely return to public display. Yet, everyone involved also recognized that desperate enemies often prove most dangerous in their final throes. Reports of German development of new weapons capable of reaching American targets reinforced the wisdom of maintaining maximum security until victory was absolutely certain. The rocket attacks on London demonstrated that technological innovation could extend the range of warfare in ways that made no location completely safe. The summer of 1944 witnessed the most intensive period of visitor activity in Biltmore's history as Americans, increasingly confident of eventual victory, sought to experience the cultural treasures that represented what they were fighting to preserve. The irony was not lost on anyone involved that tourists came to admire the Vanderbilt collection while standing just yards away from even greater treasures they could never imagine were hidden nearby. Managing these unprecedented crowds while maintaining operational security required every skill that Edith had developed through decades of hosting social events and managing public relationships. She found herself serving simultaneously as gracious hostess, security coordinator, and keeper of one of the most important secrets in American history. The strain was enormous, but her commitment never wavered. The estate staff rose to meet these challenges with dedication that reflected their deep loyalty to both the Vanderbilt family and the national mission they were supporting. Groundskeepers maintained perfect landscaping while discreetly monitoring for signs of suspicious activity. Tour guides managed increased visitor loads while carefully steering groups away from restricted areas. Kitchen staff prepared meals for both tourists and security personnel without revealing the true nature of the enhanced protection measures. Cornelia proved invaluable during this period, her youthful energy and fresh perspective bringing new ideas for managing the complex logistics of their double life. She developed innovative crowd control techniques that appeared to enhance visitor experience while actually improving security monitoring. Her natural charm and genuine enthusiasm for sharing Biltmore's history made her an ideal ambassador for maintaining the estate's public image. The autumn months brought news from Europe that made everyone connected to the operation increasingly optimistic about the war's eventual outcome. Allied forces were advancing on multiple fronts, German resistance was showing signs of collapse, and intelligence reports suggested that enemy capability to threaten American targets was rapidly diminishing. These developments prompted renewed discussions about when it might be safe to begin planning the return of the artworks to Washington. Finley found himself caught between his desire to restore normal operations at the National Gallery and his recognition that premature action could still prove disastrous if the war took an unexpected turn. The decision-making process was complicated by the fact that the Biltmore operation had proven so successful that some officials argued for making it permanent. The artworks had never been safer or better protected than they were in their mountain fortress, and the security arrangements that had been developed could serve as a model for protecting cultural treasures during future crises. Edith's position on these discussions reflected her deep understanding of both the practical and symbolic importance of returning the artworks to public display. While she had been honored to serve as their guardian during the nation's darkest hour, she knew that these masterpieces belonged in museums where they could fulfill their true purpose of inspiring and educating the American people. The winter of 1944 marked 3 years since the artworks had arrived at Biltmore, a milestone that prompted reflection on everything that had been accomplished and preserved during this extraordinary period. The secret had been kept perfectly despite countless opportunities for exposure. The artworks remained in pristine condition despite being housed in facilities never intended for such purposes. Most remarkably, the operation had demonstrated that private citizens could serve their country in ways that went far beyond traditional concepts of patriotic duty. The love story that had created Biltmore had evolved into something that protected the very essence of American civilization during its greatest trial. The bonds that had formed among the people involved in the operation had grown stronger with each passing month, creating relationships that transcended their official responsibilities. They had become a family united by shared purpose and absolute trust, understanding that their success depended on unwavering commitment from everyone involved. As 1945 began, the signs of impending victory became increasingly unmistakable. German forces were retreating on all fronts. Their capacity for offensive action had been virtually eliminated, and intelligence reports suggested that the Nazi regime was beginning to collapse from within. Yet, the possibility of desperate last-ditch attacks against American targets meant that vigilance remained essential until final victory was achieved. The estate continued its remarkable double life with practiced efficiency, but everyone could sense the approaching end of their extraordinary mission. The artworks that had waited patiently in their hidden sanctuary would soon be able to return to the public display they had been created to enjoy. Edith found herself experiencing conflicting emotions as she contemplated the eventual end of the operation that had defined her life for over 3 years. While she looked forward to returning to a more normal existence, she also recognized that serving as guardian of America's greatest cultural treasures had been the most meaningful work of her entire life. The love story that had begun with George and Edith's meeting on an ocean liner had reached its ultimate expression in this act of national service. Their shared vision of using privilege to serve others had evolved into something that could protect the artistic achievements of centuries during humanity's darkest hour. The flowers that bloomed each spring in the gardens they had created together seemed to symbolize the enduring power of beauty to survive even the most devastating attempts to destroy it. The artworks hidden within their home represented the same triumph of human creativity over forces of destruction. The approaching liberation of Europe brought with it reports that confirmed the wisdom of every precaution that had been taken to protect America's cultural treasures. Allied forces advancing through Germany discovered the full extent of Nazi art looting operations, finding warehouses filled with stolen masterpieces and evidence of systematic destruction of works deemed unacceptable by Nazi ideology. The photographs and testimonies that emerged from these discoveries served as stark reminders of what could have been lost if different decisions had been made during those crucial months in 1941 and 1942. The artworks that had found sanctuary at Biltmore represented not just individual masterpieces, but entire traditions of human creativity that would have been obliterated if they had fallen into enemy hands. The vindication of their efforts brought both relief and renewed determination to maintain security until absolute victory was achieved. Everyone involved understood that their success had preserved something irreplaceable for future generations, demonstrating how individual sacrifice could serve collective benefit in ways that changed the course of history. As spring returned to the mountains of North Carolina in 1945, the estate prepared for what everyone hoped would be the final phase of their extraordinary mission. The war in Europe was entering its closing stages, but the conflict in the Pacific reminded everyone that global victory remained incomplete. The artworks that had waited so patiently in their hidden sanctuary had become symbols of everything America was fighting to preserve. They represented not just artistic achievement, but the values of beauty, truth, and human dignity that gave meaning to the struggle against tyranny and hatred. The bonds forged among the people protecting these treasures had created something that would endure long after the war ended. They had proven that love could indeed become the foundation for protecting a nation's soul, that private virtue could serve public necessity in ways that honored both individual sacrifice and collective heritage. The love story that had created Biltmore was approaching its most triumphant chapter, as the fortress built by two hearts would soon release the cultural treasures it had protected back to a world finally safe enough to celebrate beauty without fear. The greatest love story of duty in American history was about to reach its magnificent conclusion, proving that some things are indeed worth risking everything to protect. The announcement that came crackling through radio sets across America on May 8, 1945, brought celebrations that had been building in hearts for years. Victory in Europe. The Nazi regime had finally collapsed. Hitler was dead. And the war that had consumed the continent for 6 devastating years was finally over. At Biltmore Estate, the news arrived like spring rain after the longest drought in memory, washing away years of tension and fear with the sweet promise of peace restored. But for those who knew the secret hidden within the mountain mansion's walls, this moment carried significance that went far beyond the general celebration sweeping across the nation. The artworks that had waited so patiently in their hidden sanctuary were finally safe from the threat that had driven them into exile. The greatest cultural treasures of American civilization could begin their journey home. Edith Vanderbilt stood in the music room for the first time since the steel doors had been sealed 3.5 years earlier, gazing upon the masterpieces that had transformed her home into something unprecedented in American history. The works by Raphael, Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Van Dyck seemed to glow in the carefully controlled lighting, as if they too understood that their long vigil was approaching its end. The process of preparing for the artwork's departure required the same meticulous planning that had characterized their arrival, but now the secrecy that had protected them could gradually give way to celebration. David Finley arrived from Washington with a team of specialists who would oversee every aspect of the return journey, their faces bright with relief and satisfaction at having successfully completed one of the most challenging cultural preservation efforts in human history. The conversations that took place during those final planning sessions carried an emotional weight that went far beyond mere logistics. These people had shared something extraordinary, had proven that private citizens could serve their country in ways that transcended traditional concepts of patriotic duty. The bonds they had forged through years of maintaining absolute secrecy would endure long after their official responsibilities ended. The estate staff who had been trusted with the secret found themselves experiencing conflicting emotions as they contemplated the end of their extraordinary mission. They had served as guardians of America's greatest cultural treasures, participating in something that would be remembered as one of the most successful security operations in the nation's history. Yet, they also looked forward to returning to the simpler rhythms of normal life. Cornelia proved invaluable during this transition period, her energy and organizational skills helping to coordinate the complex logistics of returning the estate to purely civilian operations. The security measures that had been so carefully concealed would need to be removed with the same discretion that had characterized their installation, leaving no trace of the fortress that had existed within the elegant mansion. The technical challenges of preparing the artworks for transport required updating the protective systems that had been developed during their original journey to North Carolina. Advances in material science and transportation technology made possible improvements that would ensure even greater safety during their return to Washington, reflecting the lessons learned through years of caring for these irreplaceable treasures. Each painting received individual attention from conservators who examined every detail for signs of deterioration or damage that might have occurred during their mountain exile. The results exceeded everyone's most optimistic expectations. The climate-controlled environment and security measures had preserved these masterpieces in condition that was actually better than when they had arrived, proving the effectiveness of the unprecedented preservation effort. Gilbert Stuart's George Washington portrait, the iconic image that had symbolized American values throughout the war, was among the first pieces prepared for departure. The face that had gazed from currency and classrooms across the nation would soon return to public display, carrying with it the story of how private sacrifice had protected the symbols of democratic ideals during their greatest trial. The summer of 1945 brought a different atmosphere to Biltmore as visitors arrived with new understanding of what the estate represented. The war's end had revealed the full extent of cultural destruction that had occurred across Europe, making Americans increasingly aware of how precious and fragile their own artistic heritage truly was. The tourists who walked through the magnificent rooms seemed to appreciate more deeply the beauty and significance of what they were experiencing. The staff who had maintained the estate's public operations throughout the secret years found themselves able to relax in ways they had almost forgotten were possible. The constant vigilance that had characterized every interaction with visitors could finally give way to the genuine hospitality that had always been Biltmore's hallmark. Tour guides no longer needed to carefully steer groups away from restricted areas, and security personnel could focus on normal protection rather than counterintelligence operations. Edith discovered that the end of her role as guardian of America's cultural treasures brought both relief and an unexpected sense of loss. The responsibility had been enormous and sometimes overwhelming, but it had also given her life a purpose that went beyond personal interests. She had proven to herself and to history that the values she and George had shared could serve something far greater than their own happiness. The conversation she had with David Finley during those final weeks revealed the depth of friendship that had made their extraordinary collaboration possible. Their relationship had been tested by years of shared secrets and mutual dependence, emerging stronger and more meaningful than either had imagined possible when their wartime partnership began. The planning for the artwork's departure required coordination with multiple government agencies and security services. But now, the elaborate deceptions that had characterized the operation could be replaced with more straightforward procedures. The return journey would be conducted with appropriate dignity rather than covert secrecy, reflecting the nation's growing confidence in its ability to protect its cultural heritage through normal means. The selection of the departure date carried symbolic significance that honored both the practical requirements of the operation and the emotional needs of everyone who had participated in this unprecedented effort. They chose a clear day in late August, when the mountain air was crisp and the summer crowds had diminished, allowing for a ceremony that balanced security concerns with appropriate recognition of what had been accomplished. The night before the departure, Edith walked alone through the gardens where she and George had once planned their shared future, thinking about how their love story had evolved into something that protected the artistic achievements of centuries. The flowers that bloomed around her seemed to whisper of all the beauty that would endure because of the choices made by people who understood that some things were worth risking everything to preserve. The morning of August 23rd brought perfect weather for the most significant departure in Biltmore's history. The convoy that assembled in the circular drive looked remarkably similar to the vehicles that had arrived through a amidst snowstorm 3.5 years earlier, but now they carried the confidence of a nation that had proven its ability to protect what mattered most. The loading process proceeded with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized every aspect of the operation, but now the atmosphere was one of celebration rather than desperate urgency. Each crate that left the music room represented not just a rescued masterpiece, but a victory over the forces that would have destroyed the highest achievements of human creativity. David Finley supervised every detail of the departure with emotions that reflected the magnitude of what was ending. The friendship with Edith Vanderbilt that had made this operation possible had been tested and strengthened through years of shared responsibility for protecting America's cultural soul. Their collaboration had proven that private virtue could serve public necessity in ways that changed the course of history. The moment when the steel doors of the music room closed for the final time marked the end of an era that would be remembered as one of the most successful cultural preservation efforts in human history. The space that had served as America's most secret fortress would return to its intended purpose, but it would forever carry the memory of the treasures it had protected during the nation's darkest hour. The convoy's departure from Biltmore received the kind of public celebration that had been impossible during the artwork's secret arrival. Motorcycle escorts with sirens blazing, photographers documenting every moment, and crowds of well-wishers who finally understood what had been hidden in their mountain community for over 3 years. The contrast between secret arrival and triumphant departure symbolized everything about America's journey from vulnerable isolation to confident victory. Edith stood on the front steps of the house she had shared with George, watching until the last vehicle disappeared around the curve of the approach road. The estate felt different now, somehow both emptier and more peaceful than it had been for years. The extraordinary chapter of her life was ending, but the legacy of what had been accomplished would endure forever. The love story that had begun on an ocean liner in 1897 had reached its most magnificent conclusion, proving that private affection could create something strong enough to protect the very essence of civilization during its greatest trial. The fortress that love had built had served its purpose perfectly, demonstrating that individual sacrifice could preserve collective heritage in ways that honored both personal devotion and national service. The artworks that had found sanctuary in the mountains of North Carolina carried with them the story of how Americans had chosen to protect beauty rather than surrender to fear. How private citizens had served their country in ways that transcended traditional concepts of patriotic duty. How love could indeed become the foundation for protecting a nation's soul. The greatest love story of duty in American history had reached its triumphant ending, but its influence would continue echoing through generations of Americans who would visit museums and galleries without ever knowing how close they had come to losing the masterpieces that defined their cultural heritage. The secret fortress had returned its treasures to the world, but the love that had protected them would remain forever as a testament to what ordinary people could accomplish when they understood that some things were truly worth risking everything to preserve. Worth risking everything to preserve. And so we reach the end of this extraordinary tale that began with two hearts finding each other on the deck of an ocean liner and culminated in the protection of America's cultural soul during its darkest hour. The love story of George and Edith Vanderbilt proved that private virtue could serve public necessity in ways that changed the course of history itself. What started as a romance built on shared dreams of beauty and service evolved into something far greater than personal happiness. It became the foundation for one of the most successful cultural preservation efforts in human history, demonstrating that when love creates something meaningful, it possesses the strength to protect what matters most when everything hangs in the balance. The secret that was kept for over 3 years at Biltmore Estate saved masterpieces by Raphael, Rembrandt, Vermeer, and countless other masters from the forces that destroyed so much of Europe's artistic heritage. But more than that, it proved that individual acts of courage and sacrifice could preserve the very essence of civilization for future generations. Today, when you visit the National Gallery of Art and stand before Gilbert Stuart's George Washington portrait, you're looking at more than just a painting. You're witnessing the triumph of love over hatred, of hope over despair, of ordinary people who chose to risk everything they held sacred rather than surrender to the darkness that threatened to consume the world. The fortress that love built at Biltmore may have returned its treasures to public display, but the legacy of what was accomplished there continues to remind us that the greatest acts of patriotism often happen not on battlefields, but in quiet moments when someone chooses to protect beauty rather than surrender to fear. This story challenges us to consider what we would be willing to risk for the sake of preserving what makes life worth living. Because sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't found in armies or weapons, but in two hearts that understand their love can create something strong enough to shelter the soul of a nation when it needs protection most. Have you ever wondered what happens when ordinary people are forced to make impossible choices? When the world around them crumbles, and everything they once believed in turns to ash, what drives them to keep going? What compels them to risk everything for someone they barely know? This is a story about courage found in the most unexpected places, about love that blooms in the shadow of hatred, about hope that refuses to die even when darkness seems absolute. It is a story that changed my understanding of what it truly means to be human. What you are about to hear happened 78 years ago. The events I will share with you are not fiction. They are not Hollywood dramatization. Every moment, every conversation, every heartbreaking decision actually occurred. The people in this story were real. Their pain was real. Their love was real. Their sacrifice was real. I discovered this story 3 years ago while researching historical archives in a small European town. Hidden in a collection of wartime documents, I found a series of letters that told an extraordinary tale of compassion in the face of cruelty. Letters that revealed how two strangers became each other's salvation when the world had gone completely mad. The woman who wrote these letters kept them hidden for decades. She never spoke of what happened, never told her children or grandchildren about the choices she made during those terrible months. It was only after her death that her family discovered the truth about who she really was during humanity's darkest hour. Her name was Elena Rosenberg. She was 24 years old when this story begins. She worked as a seamstress in a small town outside Prague. She lived alone in a modest apartment above the tailor shop where she spent her days mending clothes and dreaming of a different life. She had plans to marry her childhood sweetheart when he returned from university. She wanted children. She wanted a garden filled with roses. She wanted what every young woman wants, a future filled with possibility. But history had other plans for Elena Rosenberg. On March 15th, 1941, everything changed. The occupation forces arrived in her town just after dawn. Elena watched from her window as soldiers marched down the cobblestone streets she had walked since childhood. She watched as neighbors she had known her entire life suddenly looked away when certain families passed by. She watched as signs appeared in shop windows, signs that divided her community into categories she had never imagined could exist. Within weeks, Elena's world became unrecognizable. The tailor shop where she worked was closed. Her Jewish customers were no longer allowed to enter. Her employer, an elderly man named Samuel, who had taught her everything about needlework, simply disappeared one night. Nobody spoke of where he went. Nobody dared to ask. Elena found herself unemployed, frightened, and increasingly isolated. The man she planned to marry stopped writing letters. Her friends became distant. The town she loved had transformed into a place where trust was dangerous and kindness could cost you everything. But Elena Rosenberg possessed something that no amount of fear could destroy. She possessed an unshakable belief in the fundamental goodness of human beings. She believed that even in the darkest circumstances, people could choose compassion over cruelty. She believed that love was stronger than hate. She believed this with every fiber of her being, even when the evidence around her suggested otherwise. It was this belief that led Elena to make a decision that would change two lives forever. On a cold November evening, Elena heard a soft knocking at her back door. She lived alone now, and visitors were rare, especially visitors who came in the darkness. She approached the door cautiously, her heart pounding with uncertainty. When she opened it, she found a young man standing in the shadows. He was roughly her age, thin from hunger, wearing a torn uniform she recognized but feared. His name was Thomas Muller. He was a German soldier who had deserted his unit 3 days earlier. He had been walking for miles, hiding in barns and abandoned buildings, surviving on scraps of food he found along the way. He was exhausted, terrified, and completely alone in enemy territory. Thomas had knocked on Elena's door not because he knew who she was, but because hers was the only window showing light in the entire neighborhood. He was desperate enough to risk everything on the hope that whoever lived inside might show mercy to a stranger. When Elena opened that door and saw Thomas standing there, she faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could turn him away. She could report him to the authorities. She could protect herself and pretend this encounter never happened. These would have been the safe choices, the expected choices, the choices most people would have made without hesitation. Instead, Elena Rosenberg looked into the eyes of this frightened young man, and saw something that changed everything. She saw her own fear reflected back at her. She saw someone who was just as lost and scared as she was. She saw a human being who needed help. Without saying a word, Elena stepped aside and let Thomas Muller into her home. This single act of kindness set in motion a series of events that neither of them could have imagined. What began as one desperate night of shelter evolved into something far more profound. Over the following weeks, as Thomas hid in Elena's small apartment, they began to understand each other in ways that transcended the artificial boundaries the world had created around them. Thomas told Elena about his life before the war. He had been a teacher in a small German village. He loved literature and music. He had planned to become a professor someday. He spoke of his mother who baked bread every Sunday and sang while she worked in her garden. He talked about his younger sister who wrote him letters filled with drawings and jokes. He was not a monster. He was not evil. He was simply a young man who had been caught in circumstances beyond his control. Elena shared her own dreams and fears. She told Thomas about Samuel, the elderly tailor who had vanished. She spoke of her childhood, of lazy summer afternoons spent reading by the river. She described the wedding dress she had been designing for herself, now hidden away in a trunk she no longer opened. She revealed her terror about what was happening to her community, her confusion about how neighbors could turn against neighbors so quickly. As days turned into weeks, something unexpected began to grow between them. It started as mutual understanding. It deepened into genuine friendship, and eventually, despite everything that should have kept them apart, it blossomed into love. This was not a love born of convenience or desperation. This was not a temporary arrangement designed to help them survive. This was real love, the kind that makes people willing to sacrifice everything for another person's happiness. The kind that makes people believe in tomorrow even when today seems hopeless. But their love existed in a world that had declared such feelings impossible. Elena was harboring an enemy soldier. Thomas was falling in love with someone his uniform said he should consider beneath him. Every moment they spent together increased the danger they both faced. Every day that passed brought them closer to discovery. Every night they held each other. They knew it might be their last. The townspeople were becoming suspicious. Elena's neighbors had noticed that she rarely left her apartment anymore. They wondered why her lights were on at strange hours. They questioned why she had suddenly started buying twice as much food from the market. In a community where everyone watched everyone else, even the smallest changes in routine could prove fatal. Thomas knew he could not stay hidden forever. He understood that his presence was putting Elena in terrible danger. He also knew that he could never leave her. The war had taken everything else from him, but it had also given him the most precious gift of his life. How do you walk away from the only person who makes you want to keep living? Elena faced her own impossible dilemma. She could help Thomas escape to neutral territory, knowing she would probably never see him again. She could continue hiding him, knowing that discovery meant death for both of them. Or she could make the ultimate sacrifice and turn him in herself, hoping to save at least one of their lives. These were the choices that kept Elena awake at night. These were the questions that haunted every conversation they shared. How do you choose between love and survival? How do you weigh one life against another? How do you make decisions when every option leads to heartbreak? The answer came sooner than either of them expected. In Intertwines, December 7th, 1941. Elena woke to the sound of vehicles stopping outside her building. She looked out her window and saw soldiers surrounding the entire block. Someone had reported suspicious activity. Someone had betrayed them. Elena had perhaps 5 minutes before the soldiers reached her door. 5 minutes to decide how this story would end. 5 minutes to choose who would live and who would die. Thomas was still sleeping when Elena gently shook him awake. She told him what was happening. She told him there was no time for lengthy goodbyes or elaborate plans. She told him he had to trust her completely if either of them had any chance of survival. What Elena did next required a kind of courage that most of us will never be asked to demonstrate. It required her to act against every instinct that told her to protect the person she loved most in the world. It required her to become someone she never imagined she could be. The soldiers were climbing the stairs now. Their heavy boots echoed through the building like thunder. Elena could hear them checking each apartment, demanding to see identification papers, searching for anything suspicious. Thomas looked into Elena's eyes and saw her plan reflected there. He understood what she was going to do. He tried to protest, tried to find another way, tried to convince her that they could face whatever came together. But Elena had already made her choice. She had chosen love over safety. She had chosen his life over her own. She had chosen to become the kind of person who does the right thing even when it costs them everything. The knocking on her door began just as Elena finished hiding Thomas in the one place she knew they would never think to look. The soldiers were demanding entry. They were shouting commands in a language that sounded harsh and foreign in the small apartment where she had experienced the most tender moments of her life. Elena took one last look around her home, at the bed where she and Thomas had whispered dreams of their future together, at the small table where they had shared countless meals and conversations, at the window where they had watched the sun rise and promised each other that somehow, someday, they would find a way to be together in a world at peace. Then Elena Rosenberg opened her door and stepped forward to meet whatever fate awaited her. Fate awaited her. The soldiers pushed past Elena without ceremony, their rifles raised and ready. Their leader, a stern-faced officer with cold gray eyes, began barking orders to his men. They moved through her small apartment like a destructive force, overturning furniture, emptying drawers, tearing through her belongings with calculated efficiency. Elena stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos, her hands clasped in front of her to stop them from trembling. She watched these strangers destroy the sanctuary she had created with Thomas, the sacred space where they had discovered that love could exist even in hell. Every crash of breaking pottery, every rip of torn fabric felt like a physical blow to her heart. The officer approached her with deliberate slowness, studying her face for any sign of deception. He spoke in broken Czech, his accent thick and intimidating. He wanted to know why neighbors had reported strange sounds from her apartment. He wanted to know why she had been purchasing extra food. He wanted to know if she was hiding anyone. Elena met his gaze directly, calling upon reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. She told him she lived alone. She told him she had been eating more because food was becoming scarce and she was hoarding what she could find. She told him the sounds were probably rats in the walls. Her voice remained steady throughout each lie, even as her soul screamed in terror. The soldiers continued their search with increasing aggression. They stabbed their bayonets into her mattress, sending feathers floating through the air like snow. They checked inside her wardrobe, behind her small stove, under every piece of furniture in the room. They were thorough and methodical, leaving no possible hiding place unexplored. Elena's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. She forced herself to think of ordinary things, of bread baking in an oven, of children playing in summer gardens, of anything except the man she loved, hidden just feet away from these soldiers who would kill him without hesitation if they discovered him. Minutes felt like hours as the search continued. The officer questioned Elena again, this time more aggressively. He seemed frustrated by their inability to find whatever they had come looking for. He pressed her for information about her neighbors, about anyone who might be acting suspiciously, about any strangers she might have seen in the area. Elena answered each question with the same calm composure, even as sweat beaded on her forehead despite the winter cold. She understood that her performance in these moments would determine whether she and Thomas lived or died. There was no room for error, no second chance if she revealed even the slightest hint of deception. One of the younger soldiers approached his commanding officer and whispered something in his ear. Elena's blood turned to ice as she realized what he was suggesting. They wanted to check the cellar beneath the building, the cellar where other residents stored their winter supplies, the cellar that connected to a network of tunnels originally built for storing wine but now serving more desperate purposes. The officer nodded and ordered 2 of his men to investigate below. Elena knew that if they discovered the entrance to those tunnels, they would eventually find others who were hiding throughout the neighborhood. Her secret was not the only secret these walls protected. Her choice to help Thomas had connected her to a larger network of people who had decided that humanity mattered more than politics. As the soldiers prepared to search the cellar, Elena made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She told the officer that she had heard strange sounds coming from the apartment directly below hers. She said she believed someone might be hiding there instead. She pointed them toward the home of Mrs. Kozlova, an elderly widow who lived alone and rarely spoke to anyone. The lie came so easily that it terrified her. Elena had become someone capable of misdirecting suspicion onto an innocent neighbor to protect the man she loved. She had crossed a moral line she never imagined she would cross, and she had done it without hesitation. This realization brought with it a crushing understanding of what war did to people. It did not just destroy buildings and cities. It destroyed the very foundations of who you believed yourself to be. The officer considered her suggestion, studying her face for signs of manipulation. Elena forced herself to maintain eye contact, to project the concerned helpfulness of a good citizen reporting suspicious activity. Inside, she felt pieces of her soul breaking away, but she held her expression steady. After what felt like an eternity, the officer decided to investigate her claim. He ordered most of his men to search the apartment below while leaving 2 soldiers to continue examining Elena's home. As their footsteps thundered down the stairs, Elena offered a silent prayer of forgiveness to Mrs. Kozlova and a desperate plea that the elderly woman would somehow survive what was about to happen. The remaining soldiers resumed their search with less intensity than before. They seemed convinced that the real target lay elsewhere in the building. Elena used their distraction to position herself near the hiding place where Thomas remained concealed, hoping her presence might somehow shield him from discovery. She could hear shouting from the apartment below, followed by the sound of furniture being violently moved. Mrs. Kozlova's voice rose in frightened protest, pleading in check for them to leave her alone. Elena closed her eyes and tried to block out the sounds, but she could not escape the knowledge that her lie had brought suffering to an innocent person. One of the soldiers searching her apartment called out to his companion, pointing to something he had found behind her small cooking area. Elena's heart stopped as she realized he was examining the loose floorboard where she sometimes stored extra food. If he decided to pry it up, he would discover the small space she had carved out for emergencies. He would find evidence that someone else had been living in her apartment. The soldier knelt down and began working at the floorboard with his knife. Elena watched in helpless terror as he slowly worked the board loose. She knew that beneath it, he would find scraps of masculine clothing Thomas had discarded, along with papers bearing his name and identification. There would be no explaining away such evidence. Just as the floorboard was about to come free, a tremendous crash echoed from the apartment below, followed by women screaming. The soldiers in Elena's room immediately abandoned their search and rushed toward the stairs, drawn by the commotion their colleagues had apparently discovered. Elena found herself alone in her destroyed apartment for the first time in over an hour. She used these precious moments to whisper Thomas's name, to let him know she was still there, to assure him that somehow they were still alive. She could not see him or touch him, but she could feel his presence like a warm light in the darkness that surrounded them. The sounds from below grew more violent and disturbing. Elena heard Mrs. Kozlova crying, pleading for mercy in a voice that broke Elena's heart. She heard soldiers laughing, making jokes she could not understand but whose cruelty transcended language. She heard furniture being destroyed and possessions being thrown against walls. Then, suddenly there was silence. The quiet that followed was more terrifying than any of the noise that had preceded it. Elena knew what that silence meant. She knew what had happened to Mrs. Kozlova. She knew that her lie had cost an innocent woman her life. This knowledge settled into her bones like poison, a guilt she would carry forever. Heavy footsteps climbed the stairs once more. The officer returned to Elena's apartment, his uniform now disheveled, and his mood visibly improved. He looked around her destroyed home with satisfaction, as though the violence below had somehow validated his suspicions about the entire building. He approached Elena one final time, standing close enough that she could smell tobacco on his breath. He told her that they had found what they were looking for downstairs. He said the building was now considered secure. He warned her that any future suspicious activity would result in consequences far more severe than a simple search. Elena nodded her understanding, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. The officer studied her face one more time, perhaps looking for guilt or fear or any emotion that might suggest she was hiding something. Elena forced herself to appear relieved that the ordeal was over, grateful that the soldiers had uncovered whatever threat had been lurking in her building. Apparently satisfied, the officer signaled to his remaining men. They gathered their equipment and prepared to leave, their mission apparently complete. Elena watched them file out of her apartment, each step taking them further away from the truth they had come so close to discovering. As the last soldier disappeared down the stairs, Elena remained frozen in place, afraid to move or speak or even breathe too loudly. She waited until she heard their vehicles start and drive away before she finally allowed herself to collapse onto what remained of her sofa. Only then did she whisper Thomas's name, again, this time loud enough for him to hear clearly. Only then did she begin the careful process of helping him emerge from the hiding place that had saved his life. Only then did she allow herself to fully comprehend the magnitude of what had just occurred. Thomas emerged slowly, his body cramped from hours of forced stillness, his face pale with the understanding of how close they had come to death. He looked around at the destruction of their sanctuary, at the remnants of the life they had built together scattered across the floor like broken dreams. But when his eyes met Elena's, neither of them spoke of the search, or the soldiers, or their miraculous survival. Instead, they spoke of Mrs. Kozlova. They spoke of the price that had been paid for their safety. They spoke of the innocent blood that now stained Elena's hands. Thomas tried to comfort Elena, to convince her that she had no choice, that anyone would have done the same thing in her situation. But Elena knew better. She knew that she had chosen his life over another person's life. She knew that love had made her capable of terrible things. She knew that surviving this war would require her to become someone she never wanted to be. This realization marked a turning point in their relationship. Their love remained as strong as ever, but it was now shadowed by the understanding of what they were willing to do to protect each other. They had entered a realm where moral certainties no longer existed, where good people were forced to make choices that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The apartment they had shared was no longer safe. Too many people had seen the soldiers search the building. Too many questions would be asked about what had happened to Mrs. Kozlova. They needed to find somewhere else to hide, somewhere else to continue their impossible love affair in a world determined to destroy it. But where could they go? How could they start over when every day brought new dangers, new suspicions, new opportunities for betrayal? How could they rebuild their sanctuary when the war seemed to be expanding rather than ending, consuming more lives and destroying more communities with each passing month? These questions would soon be answered in ways neither Elena nor Thomas could have anticipated. Their story was far from over. In fact, the most challenging chapters lay ahead, chapters that would test not only their love for each other, but their very understanding of what it meant to remain human in an inhuman world. The war was about to demand even greater sacrifices from them, even greater moral compromises, even greater acts of courage and desperation. But it would also reveal the true depth of their commitment to each other and to the belief that love could survive anything, even the end of the world as they knew it. They knew it. That same night, while Elena and Thomas huddled together in the ruins of their destroyed apartment, they made a decision that would forever alter the trajectory of their story. They could not remain in this place where Mrs. Kozlova's blood had been spilled because of Elena's desperate choice. They could not continue living with the daily terror of discovery. They needed to disappear completely. Thomas knew of a place. During his days as a deserter, before finding Elena's door, he had discovered an abandoned farmhouse deep in the forest outside town. The family who once lived there had vanished months earlier, leaving behind only empty rooms and overgrown fields. It was isolated, forgotten, and dangerous in entirely different ways than the apartment they were leaving behind. Elena understood that moving to this farmhouse meant severing her last connections to the life she had known. She would be leaving behind not just her home, but her identity as Elena Rosenberg, the seamstress who had grown up on these streets. She would become someone new, someone without history or documentation, someone who existed only in the shadows between worlds. They waited until the darkest hour before dawn to make their escape. Elena packed only what they could carry in a single bag: a few changes of clothing, some bread she had saved, the letters from her childhood sweetheart that she could never bring herself to throw away, and a small photograph of her parents who had died when she was 17. Everything else remained behind, abandoned like the life she was choosing to leave. Thomas carried nothing from his old existence except the uniform he had learned to hate and the dog-eared book of poetry he had somehow managed to keep throughout his desertion. These few possessions represented the sum total of 2 lives that had been stripped of everything except each other. They moved through the empty streets like ghosts, staying close to buildings and avoiding the patches of moonlight that might reveal their figures to any watching eyes. Elena knew every alley and shortcut in her neighborhood, knowledge that now served a purpose she had never imagined when she was simply a young woman, walking to work each morning. The journey to the farmhouse took nearly 4 hours of careful walking through forests and fields. They avoided roads entirely, navigating by starlight and intuition through terrain that became increasingly wild and untamed. Elena's feet were bleeding by the time they reached their destination, but she made no complaint. Physical pain seemed insignificant compared to the emotional wounds they both carried. The farmhouse stood like a monument to interrupted dreams. Its windows were broken, its roof partially collapsed, its garden overrun with weeds that had grown tall enough to brush against the sagging front porch. But to Elena and Thomas, it looked like salvation. It looked like a place where they might be able to exist without fear, at least for a while. They spent their first week making the farmhouse habitable. Thomas repaired the roof using materials salvaged from a collapsed barn nearby. Elena cleaned the rooms and blocked the broken windows with boards and cloth to prevent light from escaping at night. They worked mostly in silence, both understanding that this place represented their last chance at something resembling a normal life together. The farmhouse had a well that still provided clean water and a cellar that had somehow remained dry despite years of neglect. There were fruit trees on the property that had continued producing apples and pears without human care. Most importantly, there were no neighbors for miles in any direction, no one to notice smoke from their chimney or wonder about footprints in the snow. As winter deepened around their isolated refuge, Elena and Thomas discovered a different kind of existence than they had known in town. Here, their days were structured around survival rather than hiding. They gathered firewood, preserved what food they could find, and prepared for the harsh months ahead. The work was physically demanding, but emotionally healing in ways neither of them had anticipated. For the first time since they had met, they could speak freely without whispering. They could move around during daylight hours without fear of being seen through windows. They could touch each other without constantly listening for footsteps on stairs or voices in hallways. The farmhouse gave them something they had never truly possessed before: privacy. In this privacy, their relationship deepened in ways that would have been impossible in the apartment where every moment was shadowed by terror. They began to dream together about futures that extended beyond mere survival. They talked about the children they might have someday, about the garden they would plant when spring arrived, about the books Thomas would write when the world returned to sanity. Elena taught Thomas how to cook with the limited ingredients they could forage or trade for in distant villages. Thomas read poetry aloud to Elena by firelight, his voice filling the empty rooms with beauty that seemed to push back against the darkness of their circumstances. They created routines and rituals that made their temporary sanctuary feel like a real home. But even in this isolated paradise, the war continued to intrude upon their happiness. They could hear planes flying overhead at night, their engines growing louder as the conflict intensified. Sometimes they saw smoke rising from distant towns, evidence of battles being fought just beyond their small world of safety. The radio Thomas had salvaged from the farmhouse brought news that grew more disturbing with each broadcast. The reports spoke of entire communities being destroyed, of mass deportations, of atrocities that seemed to grow worse rather than better as the war progressed. Elena and Thomas realized that their personal story was playing out against a backdrop of suffering so vast that it challenged their ability to maintain hope for humanity's future. During these dark moments, they clung to each other with desperate intensity. Their love became not just a source of comfort, but a form of resistance against the forces that sought to destroy everything beautiful in the world. Every kiss was an act of defiance. Every gentle word was a declaration that tenderness could survive even in hell. As winter gave way to early spring, Elena discovered she was pregnant. The realization came gradually, through small changes in her body that she initially attributed to stress and malnutrition. But as the signs became undeniable, Elena found herself facing a new kind of impossible choice. Bringing a child into their world of hiding and uncertainty seemed almost cruel. Yet the life growing inside her represented something precious beyond measure. Hope made manifest. When Elena told Thomas about the pregnancy, he wept with a combination of joy and terror that perfectly captured their situation. This child would be born into a world at war to parents who officially did not exist, in a place where discovery meant death. But this child would also be living proof that love could create beauty even in the midst of absolute destruction. They began making preparations for a birth that would take place without doctors, without medical supplies, without any of the support systems that normally surrounded such events. Elena gathered herbs and clean cloths, while Thomas reinforced the farmhouse walls and stockpiled food for the months when she would be unable to work. They were creating a nursery in an abandoned house, preparing to welcome new life into a world determined to extinguish it. The pregnancy transformed Elena in ways that extended beyond physical changes. She developed a fierce protectiveness that made her previous acts of courage seem pale by comparison. She was no longer just fighting for her own survival or even for Thomas's life. She was fighting for their child's right to exist in a world worth inheriting. Thomas experienced his own transformation during these months. The gentle teacher who had deserted his unit because he could not bear to cause suffering became someone capable of absolute ruthlessness when it came to protecting his growing family. He began making trips to distant villages, trading labor for supplies, always careful to present himself as a local farmer rather than a deserter in hiding. These expeditions were dangerous but necessary. They needed medical supplies for the birth, additional food for the winter ahead, and information about what was happening in the wider world. Each time Thomas left the farmhouse, Elena experienced hours of terror, wondering if he would return. Each time he came back safely, they both felt as though they had been granted another small miracle. During one of these trips, Thomas learned something that changed everything. The war was turning. Allied forces were advancing from both east and west. The occupation that had seemed permanent was beginning to crumble. Liberation might be possible within months rather than years. This news brought hope, but also new fears. As occupying forces retreated, they often became more desperate and more violent. Communities that had endured years of oppression sometimes faced their worst atrocities in the final months before liberation. Elena and Thomas realized that surviving until freedom arrived might be more difficult than anything they had already endured. They began making contingency plans for various scenarios. If Allied forces approached their area, how would they prove their identities when they had been living without documentation for so long? If retreating soldiers discovered the farmhouse, where could they hide that might offer better protection than their current refuge? If Elena went into labor during a period of active fighting, how would they manage without being able to call for help? These questions became more urgent as Elena's pregnancy progressed and the sounds of war grew closer to their isolated sanctuary. Some nights, they could see flashes of artillery fire lighting up the horizon. Some days, they heard the rumble of tanks and trucks moving along roads they could not see but knew were nearby. Elena's pregnancy reached full term during the most chaotic period of the war's conclusion in their region. Retreating forces were moving through the forest around their farmhouse, while advancing Allied units pursued them. The couple found themselves trapped between two armies, unable to reveal themselves to either side without risking everything they had fought to preserve. Labor began on a night when the sound of gunfire seemed closer than ever before. Elena's contractions started just as explosions began lighting up the sky to the east. Thomas realized that their child would be born into a world literally exploding around them, entering life at the exact moment when death seemed to surround their small sanctuary. Elena labored through the night while battles raged in the distance. Thomas held her hand and whispered encouragement while machine gun fire echoed through the forest. Between contractions, Elena listened to the sounds of war and wondered what kind of world she was bringing her child into. Would this baby grow up in freedom or in a new form of oppression? Would their love story have a happy ending, or would it conclude in tragedy just as liberation seemed within reach? The baby was born just as dawn broke over a landscape transformed by war. As Elena held her newborn daughter for the first time, she looked out through the farmhouse window and saw soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms walking through their forest. These were not the occupying forces they had learned to fear. These were the liberating armies they had dreamed of seeing. But liberation brought its own complications. Elena and Thomas faced the challenge of rejoining a world they had been hiding from for over a year. They needed to explain where they had been, how they had survived, and why they were together when their backgrounds should have made such a relationship impossible. They needed to prove their identities to authorities who might view their story with suspicion rather than sympathy. Most importantly, they needed to decide what their future would look like now that they were free to make choices without the constant threat of discovery and death. The war that had brought them together was ending. The circumstances that had made their love both precious and dangerous were disappearing. Who would they become when they no longer needed to hide? These questions would define the final chapter of their extraordinary story. The chapter where Elena and Thomas would discover whether love born in darkness could survive in the light of a new world. The chapter where they would learn if the people they had become while fighting for survival could build the peaceful life they had dreamed of during their darkest moments. Their daughter's first cry had announced not just a new life, but a new beginning for all three of them. A beginning that would test whether the bonds forged in wartime could create a foundation strong enough to support a lifetime of ordinary happiness. A beginning that would reveal the true meaning of the courage they had displayed when the world demanded impossible choices from ordinary people who chose love over fear, hope over despair, and humanity over hatred. The liberation forces found Elena, Thomas, and their newborn daughter 3 days after the fighting in their area had ceased. A patrol of Allied soldiers searching abandoned buildings for survivors and stragglers discovered the small family in the farmhouse that had sheltered them through the final months of the war. The encounter could have ended in disaster. Thomas was still technically a deserter from the German army. Elena had no documentation proving her identity or explaining her presence in an abandoned house with an enemy soldier. Their infant daughter had been born without any official record of her existence. To the liberating forces, they might have appeared to be fugitives or collaborators rather than survivors. But fate intervened in the form of Captain James Morrison, a British officer who spoke fluent German and had spent years studying European languages before the war. When Thomas began explaining their situation in broken English, Morrison recognized something in his voice that went beyond mere desperation. He heard the cadence of an educated man, the vocabulary of someone who had read literature and understood poetry. Most importantly, he heard the truth. Morrison made a decision that would change 3 lives forever. Instead of arresting Thomas or questioning Elena's story, he chose to listen. For over an hour, sitting in the ruins of the farmhouse kitchen while Elena nursed their baby, Thomas told their complete story. He spoke of his desertion, of finding Elena's door, of the months they had spent hiding from a world gone mad. He described Mrs. Kozlova's death and Elena's impossible choice. He revealed the moral compromises they had made to survive. Elena added her own perspective to the narrative, speaking in the German she had learned from Thomas during their months together. She told Morrison about her life before the war, about Samuel the tailor who had disappeared, about the community that had turned against itself in fear. She described the moment she opened her door to a stranger and chose compassion over safety. Morrison listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions for clarification, but never challenging the fundamental truth of what he was hearing. He understood that he was witnessing something extraordinary, not just a story of wartime survival, but a testament to the possibility of human connection transcending the artificial barriers that politics and hatred had created. When they finished speaking, Morrison faced his own moral choice. He could follow military protocol and arrest Thomas as an enemy deserter. He could report Elena's activities to authorities who might view her assistance to an enemy soldier as treasonous. He could separate this family and consign them to the complex bureaucracy of post-war justice. Instead, Captain Morrison chose mercy. He chose to see Elena and Thomas not as enemy and collaborator, but as 2 people who had found love in impossible circumstances and created something beautiful despite the world's determination to destroy it. He chose to see their daughter not as the child of an enemy soldier, but as an innocent life that deserved protection and possibility. Morrison arranged for forged documentation that would allow the family to travel safely to a displaced persons camp, where they could begin the process of rebuilding their lives. He provided them with supplies, medical care for Elena and the baby, and most importantly, he gave them his word that their story would remain confidential until they were ready to tell it themselves. The journey to the displaced persons camp took 2 weeks of careful travel through a landscape scarred by war. Elena and Thomas saw for the first time the full extent of the destruction that had surrounded their peaceful farmhouse. Entire towns had been reduced to rubble. Bridges lay twisted in rivers. Forests bore the scars of artillery bombardments and tank battles, but they also saw signs of renewal beginning to emerge from the devastation. People were clearing debris from streets and replanting gardens. Children were playing in ruins that would someday become playgrounds again. Refugees were reuniting with families they had feared were lost forever. The human capacity for recovery was asserting itself even before the physical reconstruction could begin. The displaced persons camp, where they found temporary shelter, housed thousands of people whose lives had been shattered by the war. There were Holocaust survivors searching for family members, former prisoners of war trying to return to homelands that might no longer exist, and refugees from dozens of countries who had lost everything except their determination to build new lives. In this community of the displaced, Elena and Thomas discovered they were not unique. Everywhere around them were people who had made impossible choices, who had survived through moral compromises they never imagined they would make, who carried guilt and gratitude in equal measure. They found others who understood the complex emotions that came with surviving when so many had not. Elena gave birth to their second child, a son, in the camp's makeshift hospital 18 months after the war ended. This birth was different from their daughter's dramatic entrance into the world. There were doctors and nurses, clean sheets, and proper medical equipment, friends from the camp who brought small gifts and offered congratulations. Their son was born into a world at peace, to parents who officially existed in a place where love was celebrated rather than hidden. The growing family faced new challenges as they worked toward permanent resettlement. Thomas needed to prove his qualifications as a teacher to education officials who were skeptical of his wartime experiences. Elena struggled to find work that would utilize her skills as a seamstress while also caring for two small children. They both grappled with the psychological aftermath of their years in hiding, the nightmares and anxiety that followed them even into safety. But they also discovered joys they had never dared to imagine during their darkest moments. Their daughter took her first steps in the camp's communal courtyard while other families cheered her progress. Their son spoke his first words in 3 languages, having absorbed German from his parents, English from the camp administration, and Czech from elderly refugees who delighted in teaching him songs from their homeland. Most remarkably, Elena and Thomas found that their love, which had been forged in desperation and maintained through terror, grew stronger rather than weaker in peaceful circumstances. They had worried that their relationship might have been sustained primarily by shared danger, that ordinary life might reveal incompatibilities that crisis had masked. Instead, they discovered that their bond had been built on foundations deeper than mere survival. They married officially in the camp chapel 2 years after the war ended. The ceremony was simple but profound. Captain Morrison, who had maintained contact with them throughout their time in the camp, served as Thomas's best man. Elena wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric donated by other refugees. Their children, now toddlers, served as flower girl and ring bearer, stumbling down the aisle with the innocent joy that their parents had fought so hard to preserve. The wedding represented more than just the legal formalization of their relationship. It symbolized their transition from survivors to citizens, from refugees to residents, from people defined by what they had endured to people ready to create new futures. They were no longer Elena and Thomas who had hidden from the war. They were now Elena and Thomas who would build lives worthy of the sacrifices made for their survival. Their opportunity for permanent resettlement came in the form of sponsorship from a church congregation in a small American town. The congregation had volunteered to help refugee families establish new lives in their community, providing housing, employment assistance, and the social support necessary for successful integration. The decision to emigrate to America was difficult. It meant leaving behind the European landscape where their love story had unfolded, abandoning any remaining connections to their pre-war identities, and starting completely over in a place where they would always be foreigners, with accented English and complicated histories, but it also represented the ultimate expression of the hope that had sustained them through their darkest moments. America offered their children the possibility of growing up without the shadows of war, without the ethnic and religious divisions that had torn Europe apart, without the fear that had defined their own young lives. The ocean crossing took 2 weeks aboard a converted military transport ship filled with other refugee families seeking new beginnings. Elena spent much of the voyage standing at the ship's rail, holding her children and watching the horizon where their new country waited. She thought often during those long days about the choices that had brought them to this moment. She remembered the night Thomas had knocked on her door, the decision she had made in an instant that had changed everything. She remembered Mrs. Kozlova and the terrible price that had been paid for their survival. She remembered the farmhouse where their daughter had been born, the displaced persons camp where their son had taken his first steps, and all the people who had helped them along the way. Most of all, she remembered the moment when she had realized that love was not just an emotion but a choice she had made every day for years, even when that choice seemed likely to destroy her. A choice that had created not just a family, but a testament to the possibility of goodness surviving in a world determined to extinguish it. Thomas spent the ocean crossing writing in a journal he had started keeping in the displaced persons camp. He was documenting their story not for publication but for their children, so that someday they would understand the journey that had brought them into existence. He wrote about the teacher he had been before the war, the deserter he had become during it, and the father he was learning to be after it. He wrote about the moment he had chosen Elena over his uniform, his country, and his own safety. He wrote about the gradual process of learning that identity was not something fixed by birth or nationality, but something created through the choices one made in moments of crisis. He wrote about discovering that home was not a place but a person, and that family was not just blood, but commitment. When the ship finally docked in New York Harbor, Elena and Thomas stood together at the rail with their children in their arms, looking up at the Statue of Liberty that welcomed them to their new country. They had traveled further than the distance between Europe and America. They had journeyed from a world that said their love was impossible to a place that promised it could flourish. The small town that became their new home was nothing like the European communities where they had been born. The landscape was different, the customs were unfamiliar, and the language still felt foreign in their mouths despite years of practice. But the people who welcomed them understood something essential about their story without needing to know all the details. Thomas found work teaching in the local high school where his accent and his intensity made him a popular instructor among students who had never met anyone with direct experience of the world beyond their small community. Elena established a tailoring business that grew from mending clothes for neighbors to creating custom garments for special occasions throughout the region. Their children grew up as Americans, speaking English without accents, playing baseball and attending school dances and participating in all the ordinary activities that their parents had dreamed of but never experienced themselves. Yet, Elena and Thomas made sure their children also knew the languages of their heritage, the stories of their grandparents, and the history that had shaped their family's journey to this peaceful place. The family prospered in ways that extended beyond material success. They built a house with a garden where Elena grew the roses she had dreamed of during the war. Thomas wrote poetry in the evenings, filling notebooks with verses that captured the beauty he had learned to see even in difficult circumstances. Their children excelled in school and developed talents in music and art that their parents encouraged with the fervor of people who understood how precious such opportunities were. But success did not erase the shadows of their past. Elena continued to wake some nights thinking she heard soldiers climbing stairs. Thomas still flinched at unexpected loud noises. They both carried guilt about Mrs. Kozlova and the other innocent people who had paid prices for their survival. They understood that their happiness had been built partially on foundations of others' suffering. These shadows led them to make choices about how they would use their good fortune. They sponsored other refugee families, helping newcomers navigate the challenges they had once faced themselves. Elena volunteered at the local hospital, using her gentle manner to comfort patients who reminded her of people she had known during the war. Thomas organized cultural events that brought together immigrants from different countries, creating communities of understanding among people who might otherwise have remained strangers. Their home became a gathering place for others who carried stories of displacement and renewal. Sunday dinners often included families from a dozen different countries, speaking multiple languages around a table laden with dishes that represented the diversity of their shared American experience. These gatherings created the kind of community that Elena and Thomas had lost during the war and spent years trying to rebuild. As their children grew into teenagers, Elena and Thomas faced the challenge of deciding how much of their wartime story to share. Their daughter began asking questions about why her parents sometimes spoke in whispers, why certain topics made them change the subject, why there were no photographs from before she was born. Their son noticed that other families had grandparents and extended relatives while theirs seemed to exist in isolation. The decision to tell their children the full truth came when their daughter announced her intention to study European history in college. She wanted to understand the war that had shaped the world she inherited. Elena and Thomas realized that their own story was part of that history, and that their children deserved to know not just what had happened, but how their parents had navigated impossible choices with love as their guiding principle. The conversation lasted an entire weekend. Elena and Thomas took turns sharing different parts of their story, from Thomas's desertion through Elena's decision to help him, from their months in hiding through the birth of their daughter, from liberation through their journey to America. They spoke honestly about the moral compromises they had made, the guilt they still carried, and the gratitude that filled their hearts every day. Their children's reactions revealed how completely they had become Americans while still carrying their parents' values. They were horrified by the circumstances Elena and Thomas had endured, proud of the courage their parents had displayed, and determined to ensure that such choices would never again be forced upon innocent people. They began to understand that their comfortable American childhood had been purchased with sacrifices they were only beginning to comprehend. This conversation marked another transition in Elena and Thomas's journey. They were no longer just survivors building new lives. They had become witnesses to history, keepers of memory, and teachers of the next generation about the importance of choosing love over fear when the world demands impossible decisions from ordinary people. From ordinary people. The years that followed brought Elena and Thomas a kind of peace they had never imagined possible. Their small American town embraced them completely, and they found themselves woven into the fabric of a community that valued their contributions without dwelling on their past. Thomas became the head of the foreign language department at the high school, inspiring students to see beyond their own borders. Elena's tailoring business evolved into something more significant, employing other immigrant women and becoming a symbol of successful integration. Their daughter graduated valedictorian of her high school class and earned a scholarship to study international relations at Columbia University. She wrote her senior thesis on the moral complexities faced by civilians during wartime, drawing from interviews she conducted with her parents and other survivors in their community. The paper won national recognition and established her reputation as a thoughtful voice on human rights issues. Their son followed a different path, choosing medicine over academics. He was drawn to pediatrics, explaining to his parents that he wanted to dedicate his life to protecting the innocence that they had fought so hard to preserve in him. His gentle manner and intuitive understanding of fear made him exceptional at comforting frightened children, though he never fully explained to his colleagues why he seemed to understand trauma so deeply. As Elena entered her 50s, she began experiencing health problems that forced her to confront her own mortality. The years of stress and poor nutrition during the war had taken a toll on her body that became apparent only decades later. Thomas watched his wife struggle with the fear that she might not live to see their grandchildren, to complete the journey from survival to legacy that had defined their entire relationship. During one particularly difficult hospital stay, Elena asked Thomas to bring her the letters she had saved from her childhood sweetheart. The young man she had planned to marry before the war changed everything. She had kept them all these years, not from nostalgia, but as a reminder of the person she had been before circumstances forced her to become someone else. Reading those innocent letters from a world that no longer existed, Elena realized how completely her life had diverged from every plan she had once made. The woman who had written responses to those letters could never have imagined opening her door to an enemy soldier, could never have conceived of loving someone whose uniform represented everything she had been taught to fear, could never have dreamed of finding happiness built on foundations of such terrible moral complexity. Yet she felt no regret for the path her life had taken. Every choice that had seemed impossible at the time had led to moments of profound joy she would not trade for any alternative. Their children's laughter echoing through their American home, Thomas reading poetry aloud on quiet evenings, the simple miracle of growing old together when they had expected to die young and alone. Thomas spent those hospital visits writing letters of his own, documenting his gratitude for every day they had been given beyond their wartime expectations. He wrote to Elena about the teacher he had rediscovered in himself, about the father he had learned to become, about the husband he had grown into through her patience and love. He wrote about the man he might have been if the war had never happened, and his amazement at discovering he preferred the person he had actually become. Elena's recovery from that health crisis marked the beginning of a new chapter in their story. They decided to use their remaining years to ensure their experience would not be lost to history. They began speaking publicly about their wartime experiences, addressing high school classes, community groups, and eventually academic conferences focused on Holocaust education and refugee experiences. Their presentations were unlike typical survivor testimonies because they spoke not just about persecution and survival, but about the moral complexity of love during wartime. They discussed the impossible choices ordinary people faced when traditional ethical frameworks collapsed. They explored how human connection could transcend political boundaries even in humanity's darkest moments. Students who heard their presentations often asked how they had maintained hope during their months of hiding. Elena would explain that hope was not something they possessed, but something they created daily through small acts of kindness toward each other. Thomas would add that hope was not optimism about outcomes, but commitment to behaving with dignity regardless of circumstances. Their most powerful presentation came at their daughter's university, where Elena and Thomas addressed a packed auditorium of students studying international relations. They spoke for 2 hours without notes, taking turns sharing different aspects of their story while their daughter watched from the front row with tears streaming down her face. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 10 minutes, but what moved Elena and Thomas most deeply were the questions that came afterward. Young people wanting to understand how to make moral choices in ambiguous situations, students grappling with their own family histories of displacement and trauma, idealistic individuals seeking guidance on how to maintain humanity in inhuman circumstances. One young woman asked Elena how she lived with the guilt of Mrs. Kozlova's death. Elena's answer surprised even Thomas with its honesty. She explained that guilt was not something to overcome, but something to carry responsibly. She said the weight of that innocent woman's death had made every subsequent day more precious, every act of kindness more intentional, every choice more carefully considered. Thomas was asked whether he regretted deserting his unit, abandoning his duty to his country and his fellow soldiers. His response revealed how completely he had integrated the complexity of his wartime experience. He said he regretted the circumstances that made desertion feel necessary, but he could not regret choosing love over hatred, mercy over violence, connection over division. Their public speaking led to unexpected recognition. A documentary filmmaker approached them about telling their story on screen. A publisher expressed interest in their memoirs. A university offered Thomas a visiting professorship to teach courses on ethics during wartime. These opportunities forced them to consider how much of their private story they wanted to share with the wider world. The decision came down to their grandchildren, who were just beginning to understand their family's unique history. Elena and Thomas realized that their story would be passed down through generations, and they wanted to ensure it was told completely and honestly, rather than mythologized or simplified. They agreed to the documentary project with the understanding that it would explore not just their love story, but the moral complexities that made their choices both inspiring and troubling. The filming process took over a year and required them to revisit memories they had spent decades learning to manage. They traveled back to Europe for the first time since their emigration, standing in locations where their story had unfolded. The farmhouse where their daughter was born had been restored as a memorial to displaced persons. The town where Elena had lived was now a thriving community that bore little resemblance to the fearful place they remembered. Most emotionally challenging was visiting the site where Mrs. Kozlova's apartment building had stood. It was now a small park with a memorial listing the names of all the civilians who had died in that neighborhood during the war. Elena stood before Mrs. Kozlova's name carved in stone, finally able to speak aloud the apology she had carried silently for decades. Thomas filmed his portions of the documentary in a rebuilt classroom similar to the one where he had taught before the war. Speaking to the camera, He reflected on how his understanding of education had been shaped by his wartime experiences. He explained that true learning required grappling with moral ambiguity rather than seeking simple answers to complex questions. The documentary premiered at several international film festivals before being broadcast nationally. The response exceeded everyone's expectations. Viewers around the world connected with Elena and Thomas's story not because it provided easy answers about good and evil, but because it honestly explored how decent people navigated impossible circumstances. Letters poured in from families dealing with their own legacies of wartime trauma, from young people struggling with moral decisions in their own lives, from educators seeking resources to teach about the complexity of human behavior during crisis. Elena and Thomas found themselves inadvertently becoming counselors to people they had never met, but whose struggles resonated with their own experiences. Their story also reached people who disagreed with their choices, who felt that Elena should not have helped an enemy soldier or that Thomas should not have abandoned his military duty. These critical responses forced them to articulate why they believed personal conscience sometimes required defying official obligations, why love could be a form of resistance against systems designed to dehumanize. The debates generated by their documentary led to academic discussions about the ethics of survival, the moral status of desertion during unjust wars, and the responsibility individuals bear for systemic atrocities. Elena and Thomas watched these scholarly conversations with fascination, amazed that their personal decisions had become case studies for philosophers and ethicists. As Elena entered her 70s, she began experiencing memory problems that doctors attributed to the long-term effects of trauma and stress. Some days she would forget where she was, returning mentally to the apartment where she had first hidden Thomas or the farmhouse where their daughter was born. These episodes terrified Thomas, who feared losing the woman who had been his anchor through every transition of their shared life. But Elena's memory loss also brought unexpected gifts. Free from the weight of chronological time, she would sometimes speak to Thomas as though they were young lovers again, sharing dreams about their future with the excitement of people who had not yet lived through decades of reality. These conversations reminded Thomas of why he had fallen in love with her, of the hope and courage that had sustained them through their darkest moments. Their children struggled with watching their mother's gradual decline while simultaneously celebrating their father's remarkable vitality. Thomas, now in his mid-70s, remained sharp and energetic, taking care of Elena with the same devotion he had shown during their wartime hiding. He read to her daily, cooked her favorite meals, and maintained the garden she could no longer tend but still loved to observe from their kitchen window. The family gathered for Elena's 75th birthday, a celebration that brought together their children, grandchildren, and the extended community of friends they had accumulated over 3 decades in America. Elena was having one of her clearer days, recognizing everyone present and participating fully in conversations about family memories and future plans. During the birthday dinner, their granddaughter asked Elena what advice she would give to young people facing difficult choices. Elena's response was immediate and clear, as though she had been preparing this answer for decades. She said that choosing love over fear was not always the right decision, but it was always the brave decision. She said that sometimes the most important choice was not what you did, but who you became through doing it. Thomas added that their story proved ordinary people were capable of extraordinary moral courage when circumstances demanded it. He said their wartime experiences had taught him that heroism was not about grand gestures, but about daily decisions to treat other human beings with dignity, regardless of the cost to oneself. Their grandchildren listened with the respectful attention of young people who understood they were receiving wisdom earned through suffering they could barely imagine. These children, born into comfort and safety, struggled to comprehend the world their grandparents had navigated. Yet they absorbed the essential lesson that love required courage, that happiness required sacrifice, that freedom required people willing to risk everything to preserve it. As the evening concluded, Elena asked Thomas to read one of the poems he had written during their early years in America. He chose a piece he had composed on the anniversary of their daughter's birth, reflecting on how their love had created life in a world determined to destroy it. His voice, still strong despite his age, filled their dining room with words that captured the essence of their impossible journey from enemies to lovers to family to legacy. The poem spoke of doors opened in darkness, of strangers becoming salvation, of choices made from love rather than logic. It honored the memory of those who had died for their survival, while celebrating the life they had built from that sacrifice. It acknowledged the guilt they carried while affirming the gratitude that overwhelmed that guilt. It was, their granddaughter later wrote in her college essay, a perfect summary of what it meant to choose hope in a world that offered every reason for despair. The birthday celebration proved to be Elena's last fully coherent gathering with her entire family. Over the following months, her memory continued to deteriorate, and she began requiring constant care that Thomas insisted on providing himself. Their children offered to hire professional caregivers, but Thomas refused to let strangers tend to the woman who had risked everything to care for him when he was a stranger himself. The final phase of Elena's life became Thomas's ultimate expression of the love that had defined their relationship from its impossible beginning. He fed her when she forgot how to eat, guided her when she forgot where she was, and spoke to her constantly about their shared memories even when she could no longer respond. He treated every day as precious, understanding that their extraordinary love story was approaching its conclusion. Elena died peacefully on a spring morning with Thomas holding her hand and their children gathered around her bed. Her last words, spoken so quietly that only Thomas could hear them, were a repetition of something she had said during their first night together in the farmhouse. She whispered that she was not afraid, that love had made her brave enough for anything, that she would find him again somehow if such things were possible. The funeral drew hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Elena and Thomas's story. Former students, fellow refugees, community members, and strangers who had been moved by their documentary all came to honor a woman whose greatest achievement was choosing compassion when the world demanded hatred. Thomas delivered the eulogy himself, speaking about Elena with the same intensity he had brought to teaching and the same honesty he had brought to their public presentations. He said that Elena had saved his life not just by opening her door during the war, but by showing him every day afterward what it meant to choose love as a way of being in the world. He concluded by reading the last letter Elena had written to him, composed during one of her final clear moments. In it, she thanked him for giving her a life more beautiful than any she could have imagined, for teaching her that home was not a place but a person, for proving that love could indeed survive anything the world might demand of it. After Elena's funeral, Thomas faced a solitude more profound than anything he had experienced since those desperate days as a deserter, wandering through foreign forests. The house they had filled with laughter and conversation for 30 years now echoed with memories that seemed to whisper from every corner. Her sewing basket remained exactly where she had left it. Her reading glasses still marked the page in the novel she would never finish. Their children urged Thomas to move closer to them, to sell the house and relocate somewhere he would not be surrounded by constant reminders of loss. But Thomas understood something they could not yet grasp. These reminders were not sources of pain, but treasures beyond measure. Every object Elena had touched carried part of her spirit. Every room held conversations they had shared. Leaving this place would mean abandoning the physical foundation of their love story. Instead, Thomas began a project that would occupy the remaining years of his life. He started writing their complete story, not for publication, but for preservation. He wanted to capture every detail while his memory remained clear, to create a record that would survive long after he joined Elena in whatever came next. He wrote in the early morning hours when the house was quietest, filling notebook after notebook with memories that poured from his pen like water from a broken dam. The writing process forced Thomas to confront aspects of their story he had never fully examined. He found himself analyzing Elena's decision to help him, not just as an act of kindness, but as a moment of moral clarity that had shaped everything that followed. He explored his own transformation from soldier to deserter to teacher to husband to father, tracing the evolution of identity through choices made under pressure. Most challenging was his attempt to understand Mrs. Kozlova's death and Elena's role in it. He wrote page after page trying to capture the impossible position Elena had faced that night, the split-second decision between saving a stranger and protecting the man she loved. He explored the guilt they had both carried and the way that guilt had made them more compassionate rather than more bitter. Thomas also wrote about their children, documenting how the war's legacy had shaped the next generation in ways both visible and hidden. He described their daughter's passion for human rights work, her determination to prevent future atrocities through legal advocacy and international cooperation. He chronicled their son's gentle approach to medicine, his intuitive understanding of patients who carried trauma they could not articulate. The grandchildren appeared frequently in these pages as well. Thomas wrote about teaching them to tend Elena's garden, watching them discover the roses that had symbolized hope during the darkest period of their grandparents' lives. He described conversations around the dinner table where 3 generations grappled with questions of identity, belonging, and moral responsibility. As Thomas approached his 80th birthday, he began experiencing health problems that reminded him of his own mortality. Unlike Elena's gradual cognitive decline, his body was simply wearing out from decades of use. His hands, which had once repaired farmhouse roofs and graded thousands of student papers, now trembled when he tried to write. His eyes, which had watched for soldiers in forest shadows and later read bedtime stories to children, grew cloudy with cataracts. But his mind remained sharp, filled with memories that seemed to grow more vivid rather than fainter with age. He could recall conversations with Elena from 50 years earlier with perfect clarity while forgetting what he had eaten for breakfast. The past felt more real than the present, as though he were already beginning his journey toward whatever reunion awaited him. Thomas's declining health forced him to accept help he had resisted since Elena's death. His children hired a caregiver, a young woman named Maria, whose own family had fled violence in Central America. Thomas initially resented the intrusion, but he gradually recognized something familiar in Maria's careful attention to detail, her gentle manner with confused elderly patients, her understanding of what it meant to rebuild life after losing everything. Maria had heard about Thomas and Elena's story through the documentary that continued to air occasionally on educational television. She approached her job with the reverence of someone who understood she was caring for a living piece of history. She listened patiently as Thomas shared memories, asked thoughtful questions about his writing project, and encouraged him to continue documenting their story despite his physical limitations. When Thomas's handwriting became too difficult to read, Maria suggested he try dictating his memories while she typed them on a computer. This collaboration transformed the writing process from solitary reflection into shared conversation. Maria's questions helped Thomas explore aspects of his story he might have overlooked, while her emotional reactions reminded him of the power their experiences still held for people who had never lived through such circumstances. Through Maria, Thomas learned about contemporary refugee experiences that echoed his own family's journey. She told him about families separated at borders, about children growing up in detention centers, about people making impossible choices between safety and dignity. These stories reminded Thomas that the moral dilemmas he and Elena had faced were not historical curiosities, but ongoing human challenges. The parallel between Maria's family and his own inspired Thomas to expand his writing project. He began interviewing other refugees in their community, collecting stories that revealed common themes of displacement, adaptation, and resilience. What emerged was not just his personal memoir, but a broader exploration of how ordinary people navigated extraordinary circumstances across different times and places. One of the most moving interviews was with an elderly Vietnamese woman who had hidden American soldiers during the war in her country. Like Elena, she had made the dangerous choice to help former enemies who appeared at her door seeking mercy. Like Elena, she carried guilt about the consequences her kindness had brought to others. Like Elena, she had found that love could transcend political boundaries when human beings chose to see each other as individuals rather than representatives of opposing forces. Another powerful conversation was with a young Syrian man who had deserted his military unit rather than participate in actions he considered morally wrong. Like Thomas, he had walked away from duty as officially defined to preserve his sense of personal integrity. Like Thomas, he struggled with questions about courage and cowardice, about individual responsibility and collective obligation. These interviews convinced Thomas that his and Elena's story was part of a larger human narrative about the choices people made when systems collapsed and traditional authorities offered no moral guidance. Their love story was not unique because such love was impossible, but because circumstances had made it visible in ways that similar stories usually remained hidden. As Thomas's 80th birthday approached, his family planned a celebration that would also serve as a kind of living memorial to Elena and their shared legacy. The gathering would include not just relatives, but the extended community of people whose lives had been touched by their story. Former students, fellow refugees, friends from their church, and people who had responded to their documentary would come together to honor a love that had transcended the circumstances of its origin. The birthday party took place in the community center where Elena had once taught citizenship classes to new immigrants. The walls were decorated with photographs spanning Thomas's entire life, from his university days in Germany through his teaching career in America. But the centerpiece of the display was a series of letters Elena had written to their children over the years, sharing wisdom about marriage, family, and the importance of choosing love even when it seemed impossible. Thomas's granddaughter, now a sophomore at her mother's alma mater, had organized a presentation of her grandfather's collected writings. She read excerpts from his memoir while slides showed photographs of the places where their story had unfolded. Her voice carried Elena's cadence, Thomas noticed, the same rhythm of speech that had first captured his attention when he heard Elena moving around her apartment during those early days of hiding. The most emotional moment came when Maria read a letter Elena had dictated to her shortly before her death. In it, Elena addressed future generations of their family, sharing her hope that they would remember her and Thomas not as victims of war, but as examples of how human beings could choose connection over division, understanding over hatred, love over fear. Elena's letter concluded with advice that summarized everything she had learned through decades of navigating impossible choices. She wrote that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act rightly despite being afraid. She said that love was not a feeling, but a commitment renewed daily through small acts of kindness and large gestures of sacrifice. She reminded her descendants that freedom was not a gift to be taken for granted, but a responsibility to be honored through service to others who still sought liberation from various forms of oppression. The celebration continued late into the evening, with guests sharing their own stories of how Elena and Thomas had influenced their understanding of moral courage. Former students spoke about lessons that extended far beyond language instruction. Fellow refugees described how the couple's example had helped them navigate their own integration challenges. Community members reflected on how witnessing such enduring love had strengthened their own relationships. As the party wound down, Thomas found himself surrounded by 3 generations of family members who carried forward the values he and Elena had modeled through their choices. Their daughter continued her human rights work, now focusing specifically on protecting refugee families. Their son had established a foundation providing medical care to displaced persons. Their grandchildren were choosing career paths that reflected their understanding of service as the highest form of success. Thomas realized that night that his and Elena's story had achieved something beyond their wildest dreams during those desperate months of hiding. Their love had not only survived the war, but had created a legacy that would influence people they would never meet, in circumstances they could never imagine long after their own voices had fallen silent. The writing project that had begun as personal reflection had evolved into something approaching completion. With Maria's help, Thomas had documented not just the events of their wartime romance, but the deeper meaning those events held for understanding human nature at its best and worst. The manuscript had grown to include photographs, letters, interviews, and reflections that painted a complete picture of how two people had chosen love in a world that seemed determined to make such choices impossible. Publishers who had learned about the project through Thomas's family expressed interest in bringing the book to a wider audience. But Thomas remained ambivalent about commercial publication. He had written these words for his family, for his community, and for future generations who might face similar moral challenges. The idea of profit from their story felt somehow inappropriate, though he understood that wider distribution might help other people navigate their own impossible choices. The decision came from an unexpected source. Maria, whose own writing skills had developed through her work with Thomas, suggested that any proceeds from publication could fund scholarship programs for refugee children seeking higher education. This idea appealed to Thomas because it would transform their personal story into practical help for people facing challenges similar to those his family had once encountered. Thomas agreed to publication with the understanding that the book would be marketed not as entertainment, but as educational material for people seeking to understand the moral complexity of human behavior during crisis. The publisher agreed to donate a significant portion of proceeds to refugee assistance programs, ensuring that Thomas and Elena's story would continue helping displaced families long after its authors had passed away. The book's publication, scheduled for the anniversary of Elena's death, would mark another transition in Thomas's journey from survivor to witness to teacher to legacy. He understood that sharing their story widely meant surrendering control over how it would be interpreted, but he also recognized that such sharing was necessary if their experiences were to serve their intended purpose of helping others navigate similar challenges. As Thomas prepared for the book's release, he reflected on how completely his understanding of heroism had evolved since those early days as a young teacher in Germany. He had once believed heroes were people who performed extraordinary acts of courage in dramatic circumstances. Now he understood that heroism was often found in ordinary people making daily choices to treat others with dignity, to choose connection over division, to maintain hope when despair seemed more reasonable. Elena had been a hero not because she performed one dramatic act of rescue, but because she chose love over fear every day for decades. She had been heroic in opening her door to a stranger, in protecting that stranger despite the danger, in choosing to build a life with him despite social expectations, in raising children who understood service as the highest calling, in facing her final illness with grace and gratitude rather than bitterness and complaint. Thomas recognized his own heroism not in his decision to desert his military unit, but in his choice to become someone worthy of Elena's sacrifice. He had been heroic in learning to love across cultural and linguistic barriers, in building a family that honored both their individual histories and their shared future, in teaching students to see beyond prejudice and nationalism, in caring for Elena through her final illness with the same devotion he had shown during their wartime hiding. Their children and grandchildren were heroes in their own ways, carrying forward values learned through example rather than lecture, choosing careers that served others rather than simply pursuing personal advancement, maintaining connections to their complex heritage while fully embracing their American identity. Most importantly, Thomas understood that their story's real heroes were the people who had helped them along the way, often at great personal risk. Captain Morrison, who had chosen mercy over military protocol. The displaced persons camp administrators who had seen humanity rather than paperwork. The church congregation that had sponsored their immigration, the American community that had welcomed them without demanding they abandon their past. Maria, who had treated her caregiving work as an honor rather than just employment. These reflections filled Thomas's final entries in his memoir as he prepared to conclude a writing project that had consumed 3 years of his widowhood. The book would end not with their deaths, but with their legacy. Not with conclusions, but with questions for future generations to consider. Not with answers, but with examples of how ordinary people could choose extraordinary love when circumstances demanded impossible decisions. Thomas's 80th birthday had marked not an ending, but a beginning. The beginning of his transformation from keeper of personal memories to curator of universal truths about human nature. The beginning of his final role as teacher, sharing lessons learned through suffering and joy in equal measure. The beginning of his preparation for reunion with Elena, confident that their love story would continue influencing people long after its original authors had moved beyond the need for words to express what they had learned about choosing hope in a world that offered every reason for despair. The book's publication brought Thomas a kind of recognition he had never sought but found deeply meaningful. Reviews appeared in academic journals and popular magazines alike, praising the memoir not for its dramatic wartime episodes but for its honest exploration of how love could survive moral complexity. Readers wrote letters describing how the story had helped them understand their own family histories, their own difficult choices, their own struggles to maintain compassion in harsh circumstances. One letter particularly moved Thomas. It came from a young woman whose grandmother had been a German war bride, married to an American soldier after the conflict ended. For decades, the family had carried shame about this union, viewing it as collaboration with former enemies. Reading about Elena and Thomas had helped them understand that love could transcend political boundaries without betraying fundamental values. The woman wrote that her grandmother had finally begun sharing her own story after reading theirs. Another correspondence arrived from a high school teacher in California who had begun using excerpts from the memoir in his history classes. Students who had previously seen World War II in simple terms of good versus evil were grappling with more nuanced questions about individual responsibility, moral courage, and the complexity of human behavior during crisis. The teacher reported that these discussions had improved his students' ability to analyze contemporary conflicts with greater sophistication. Thomas found himself invited to speak at universities, libraries, and community centers across the country. Despite his advanced age and declining physical strength, he accepted many of these invitations because he recognized them as opportunities to continue the teaching that had defined his life's work. Each presentation was different, shaped by the questions his audiences asked and the contemporary issues they faced. Speaking to college students, Thomas often found himself discussing immigration policy and refugee rights. Young people who had grown up during periods of relative peace struggled to understand how ordinary citizens could support policies that separated families or denied sanctuary to desperate people. Thomas would remind them that such policies succeeded only when populations chose fear over empathy, when people forgot that refugees were individuals with stories rather than statistics to be managed. At community centers in diverse neighborhoods, Thomas encountered audiences dealing with their own integration challenges. Recent immigrants who felt caught between preserving their heritage and adapting to American culture found guidance in his description of how he and Elena had navigated similar tensions. They learned that successful integration did not require abandoning their past, but rather finding ways to honor their origins while embracing their future. Religious congregations invited Thomas to speak about faith during adversity, though he always clarified that his and Elena's story was not specifically about religious belief, but about fundamental human values that transcended any particular faith tradition. He would explain that their survival had depended not on divine intervention, but on human choices to extend mercy when hatred seemed more reasonable, to offer help when self-preservation seemed more prudent. The most challenging presentations came at military academies and veterans organizations, where Thomas addressed audiences that included people who had served in uniform during various conflicts. His discussion of desertion as a moral choice rather than cowardice generated intense debate, forcing participants to examine their own understanding of duty, honor, and individual conscience. Thomas never advocated for desertion as a general principle, but he insisted that individuals must retain the right to refuse participation in actions they considered fundamentally wrong. He would describe his own anguish at abandoning his unit, his recognition that his decision had potentially endangered his fellow soldiers, and his ongoing struggle to balance personal integrity with collective responsibility. These military audiences often included veterans who had faced similar moral dilemmas during their own service. Some had followed orders they later regretted. Others had found ways to maintain their principles while fulfilling their duties. Still others had chosen paths similar to Thomas's, leaving military service when they could no longer reconcile their conscience with their obligations. The conversations that followed these presentations were among the most intense of Thomas's speaking career. Veterans would share stories they had never told their families, describing moments when they had been forced to choose between official orders and personal values. The room would fill with recognition as people realized they were not alone in carrying the weight of impossible wartime decisions. One particularly moving encounter occurred after a presentation at a veterans hospital. An elderly man approached Thomas with tears streaming down his face, explaining that he had deserted his unit during the Korean War and had lived with shame about that decision for over 60 years. Hearing Thomas speak about conscience as a form of courage rather than weakness had lifted a burden the man had carried in isolation his entire adult life. These interactions reminded Thomas why he had agreed to share their story publicly despite his preference for privacy. Every person who found comfort, guidance, or understanding through their experiences validated the pain Elena had endured, the guilt they had both carried, and the love they had chosen to build despite impossible circumstances. As Thomas entered his 82nd year, his health began declining more rapidly. The travel required for speaking engagements became increasingly difficult, and his family grew concerned about the toll these commitments were taking on his remaining strength. But Thomas insisted on maintaining his schedule as long as physically possible, understanding that each presentation might be his last opportunity to share the lessons he and Elena had learned. Maria, still serving as his caregiver and now his collaborator on various writing projects, helped Thomas develop ways to continue his teaching despite his physical limitations. They began conducting video interviews that could be shared with schools and organizations unable to arrange in-person visits. These recordings captured not just Thomas's words, but his expressions, his gestures, and the emotional intensity he brought to sharing their story. The video project expanded to include interviews with other members of their community who had been touched by Elena and Thomas's example. Their children shared perspectives on growing up as the products of an impossible wartime romance. Former students described how Thomas's teaching had shaped their understanding of moral complexity. Fellow refugees reflected on how the couple's successful integration had provided hope during their own adjustment struggles. What emerged from these recordings was a comprehensive portrait of how one love story had rippled outward through multiple generations and communities, influencing countless individual decisions about how to treat strangers, how to respond to difference, how to choose compassion over fear in daily encounters with difficulty. Thomas also began corresponding with filmmakers, historians, and educators who wanted to use their story in various projects. He reviewed scripts for dramatic adaptations, consulted on curriculum materials for Holocaust education programs, and provided guidance for documentaries about refugee experiences. Each of these collaborations required him to revisit painful memories while ensuring that their experiences were presented accurately rather than sentimentalized. The most ambitious of these projects was a virtual reality experience being developed by a technology company that specialized in historical education. Users would be able to walk through recreated versions of Elena's apartment, the farmhouse where they had hidden, and the displaced persons camp where they had begun rebuilding their lives. Thomas served as a consultant on historical accuracy while grappling with the strange experience of seeing his memories transformed into digital environments that future students would explore. This virtual reality project raised questions about how historical trauma should be presented to generations who had no direct experience with such events. Thomas worried that immersive technology might make suffering feel like entertainment, but he also recognized its potential for helping young people understand the human cost of political decisions and the importance of individual moral choices. Working with the development team, Thomas insisted that the virtual experience include not just the dramatic moments of their story, but the quiet, daily choices that had sustained their relationship. Users would witness Elena mending Thomas's clothes by candlelight, see them sharing meager meals while discussing their dreams for the future, observe the small acts of tenderness that had made love possible even in impossible circumstances. The project also included interactive elements that forced users to make the kinds of moral decisions Elena and Thomas had faced. Should you help a stranger who might endanger your family? How do you weigh individual conscience against collective duty? When does survival require compromising your principles? These scenarios had no correct answers, but engaging with them helped users understand the complexity of human behavior during crisis. Thomas's involvement with these various educational projects reflected his evolution from survivor to teacher to legacy curator. He understood that his remaining time was limited and felt responsible for ensuring that the lessons he and Elena had learned would continue influencing people long after he was gone. Each interview, each consultation, each review of educational materials represented another deposit in an account that would pay dividends for generations. The work was exhausting, but also energizing. Thomas found that sharing their story gave meaning to his continued existence after Elena's death. Rather than simply waiting for his own end, he was actively contributing to conversations about human nature, moral courage, and the possibility of love transcending hatred. This sense of purpose sustained him through the physical discomfort and emotional difficulty of his final years. His family watched this process with admiration and concern. They were proud of their father's dedication to preserving important historical lessons, but they worried about the toll his commitment was taking on his health and happiness. Thomas seemed driven by an urgency they did not fully understand, as though he were racing against time to complete some essential task. The urgency became clearer during a family gathering for Thomas's 83rd birthday. Surrounded by children and grandchildren, he spoke about his growing sense that Elena was waiting for him somewhere, just beyond his ability to perceive. He described dreams in which she appeared not as the elderly woman ravaged by dementia, but as the young seamstress who had opened her door to a desperate stranger decades earlier. These dreams, Thomas explained, felt more real than his waking hours. In them, he and Elena would walk through gardens filled with the roses she had always loved, discussing their children's accomplishments and their grandchildren's futures. They would revisit decisions they had made during the war, but without the weight of guilt and uncertainty that had shadowed those memories during their earthly life together. Thomas's description of these dreams comforted his family while also preparing them for what seemed to be approaching. He was not afraid of death, but eager for reunion. His primary concern was ensuring that their story would continue serving its intended purpose of helping other people navigate moral complexity with courage and compassion. This concern led Thomas to make final arrangements for the various educational projects that would survive him. He established a foundation to oversee the use of their story in academic settings, ensuring that future adaptations would maintain historical accuracy and moral nuance. He recorded video messages to be played at future conferences and educational events, sharing final thoughts about the lessons their experiences offered for contemporary challenges. Most importantly, Thomas completed a series of letters addressed to his grandchildren's children, the great-grandchildren he would never meet, but whose lives would be shaped by the choices he and Elena had made during those desperate months of hiding. These letters explored themes that had defined his understanding of human nature, the importance of choosing connection over division, The possibility of love transcending artificial boundaries, the responsibility each generation bore for creating a more compassionate world. The letters revealed Thomas at his most philosophical, drawing connections between their personal story and universal questions about human nature. He wrote about the paradox that their greatest happiness had emerged from their most difficult circumstances, that their deepest love had been forged under conditions that should have made such love impossible. He explored the mystery of how ordinary people could become capable of extraordinary moral courage when circumstances demanded it, suggesting that such capacity existed in everyone, but required crisis to reveal itself. He reflected on the responsibility that came with survival, the obligation to use unearned time for purposes that honored those who had not been so fortunate. These final writings showed Thomas grappling with questions that had no definitive answers but demanded lifelong consideration. How do you forgive yourself for choices that caused others to suffer, even when those choices were necessary for greater good? How do you maintain hope when evidence suggests that human beings are more inclined toward hatred than love? How do you pass on wisdom without imposing the limitations of your own experience on future generations? Thomas's last public appearance came at a conference on refugee rights held at his daughter's university. Too frail to travel, he participated via video link from his home, with Maria's assistants managing the technology. His presentation lasted only 20 minutes, but those in attendance later described it as one of the most powerful speeches they had ever heard. Speaking directly to the camera, Thomas addressed an audience he could not see about challenges they were facing in their own time. He acknowledged that each generation confronted moral dilemmas specific to their historical moment, but insisted that certain principles remained constant across time and circumstances. The choice between fear and compassion, between self-interest and service to others, between hatred and love, appeared in different forms but required the same fundamental courage to navigate correctly. He concluded his presentation with a message that summarized everything he and Elena had learned through their impossible journey from enemies to lovers to family to legacy. They had discovered, he said, that love was not a feeling, but a decision renewed daily through countless small choices. They had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the commitment to act rightly despite being afraid. Most importantly, they had proven that ordinary people could choose extraordinary compassion when the world offered every reason for despair. The conference audience responded with a standing ovation that lasted several minutes, but Thomas could not see their appreciation through the video connection. What mattered to him was not their applause, but their understanding. He had delivered his final public message about the possibility of choosing love in a world that seemed determined to make such choices impossible. 2 weeks after the conference, Thomas suffered a stroke that left him unable to speak clearly but apparently conscious and aware of his surroundings. His family gathered at his bedside, taking turns reading from the memoir he had spent his final years completing. They shared stories about Elena, about their childhood memories, about the ways their parents' example had shaped their own understanding of what it meant to live with purpose and integrity. Thomas's granddaughter read aloud from the letters Elena had written to their children over the years, sharing her wisdom about marriage, family, and the importance of choosing love even when it seemed impossible. As she read Elena's words about courage being the decision to act rightly despite being afraid, Thomas's eyes seemed to focus with recognition and approval. On his final evening, Thomas's son sat beside his bed reading from the poetry collection that had sustained his father during those months of hiding with Elena. The verses about love transcending boundaries, about hope surviving in darkness, about the possibility of finding beauty even in the midst of suffering, filled the quiet room where Thomas was preparing for his own transition from survivor to memory. Thomas died peacefully just before dawn, with his family surrounding him and Elena's photograph visible on the bedside table, where he could see it with his final glance. His last gesture was reaching toward that photograph, as though Elena were extending her hand to guide him toward whatever reunion awaited them beyond the limitations of earthly existence. The funeral drew even larger crowds than Elena's service had attracted. People came from across the country to honor a man whose story had touched their understanding of human possibility. Former students, fellow refugees, colleagues from his teaching career, and strangers who had been moved by their documentary or memoir filled the church and spilled onto the surrounding streets. The service featured readings from Thomas's writings, performances of music he and Elena had loved, and testimonials from people whose lives had been changed by their example. Their daughter delivered a eulogy that captured both her parents' individual contributions and their collective legacy of choosing love over fear in circumstances that would have excused hatred. She concluded by reading from the final entry in Thomas's memoir, written just days before his stroke. In it, he had reflected on the extraordinary privilege of having lived long enough to see their impossible wartime romance transformed into a source of hope for people facing their own moral challenges. He wrote about his gratitude for every day beyond their original expectations, for children who had grown into compassionate adults, for grandchildren who carried forward their values, and for a community that had embraced their story as part of its own heritage. Most movingly, Thomas had written about his anticipation of reuniting with Elena, not in some vague spiritual sense, but in the specific hope that whatever came after death would allow them to continue the conversation they had begun when he knocked on her door during that desperate November evening so many decades earlier. He imagined them walking together through gardens filled with roses, finally free from the weight of impossible choices, able to love without fear of discovery or separation. The memorial service concluded with the dedication of a scholarship fund established in Elena and Thomas's honor. The fund would support refugee students pursuing higher education, ensuring that their story would continue creating practical opportunities for people facing challenges similar to those their family had once encountered. As mourners filed past the casket, many paused to leave small tokens of remembrance. Former students left apples, the traditional gift for teachers. Fellow refugees left photographs of their own families now successfully integrated into American communities. Strangers left flowers and handwritten notes describing how the couple's story had influenced their own understanding of moral courage. The cemetery where Thomas was buried beside Elena overlooked a garden maintained by the local refugee resettlement organization. Roses bloomed there year-round, tended by volunteers who included many of the families Elena and Thomas had helped welcome to their community over the years. The garden served as a living memorial to their belief that love could create beauty, even in the most difficult circumstances. In the weeks following Thomas's death, his family began receiving letters from around the world. People shared stories of how Elena and Thomas's example had influenced their own choices, their own relationships, their own understanding of what it meant to be human in an often inhuman world. These letters revealed the true scope of their legacy, extending far beyond their immediate community to touch lives they had never known existed. A teacher in Japan wrote about using their story to help students understand the moral complexity of wartime behavior. A social worker in Canada described how their example had inspired her work with refugee families. A young couple in Australia explained how reading about Elena and Thomas's enduring love had helped them navigate difficulties in their own marriage. These responses confirmed what Thomas had hoped during his final years, that their personal story had become something larger than individual experience, a testament to human possibility that would continue influencing people long after its original authors had moved beyond the need for recognition or gratitude. The various educational projects Thomas had supported before his death continued developing under the guidance of the foundation he had established. The virtual reality experience was completed and began appearing in schools and museums, allowing new generations to explore the moral landscape Elena and Thomas had navigated. The curriculum materials based on their story were adopted by educators seeking to help students understand the complexity of human behavior during crisis. Most significantly, their memoir was translated into dozens of languages and began appearing in countries where people faced contemporary versions of the moral dilemmas Elena and Thomas had encountered. Readers in refugee camps found hope in their story of successful resettlement. Families separated by conflict discovered models for maintaining love across seemingly impossible barriers. Young people struggling with questions of identity and belonging found guidance in their example of honoring the past while embracing the future. The book's success generated funding for expanded refugee assistance programs, fulfilling Thomas's vision that their story should create practical help rather than merely emotional inspiration. Scholarships were established, resettlement services were expanded, and advocacy programs were strengthened, all supported by proceeds from sharing Elena and Thomas's journey from impossible love to enduring legacy. Their children and grandchildren found themselves serving as custodians of a story that belonged not just to their family, but to anyone seeking to understand how ordinary people could choose extraordinary compassion when circumstances offered every excuse for hatred. They spoke at schools and conferences, participated in documentary projects, and maintained the various educational initiatives their parents had begun. But they also preserved the private aspects of Elena and Thomas's legacy, the family traditions and personal memories that would never be shared with the public. They tended the garden Elena had planted, maintained the recipes she had perfected, and continued the Sunday dinners where multiple generations gathered to discuss current events with the moral sophistication their grandparents had modeled. The great-grandchildren Thomas had addressed in his final letters began arriving, children who would grow up knowing their family's story as naturally as other children learned fairy tales. These newest members of the family would inherit not just genetic material, but moral expectations, understanding from their earliest years that they carried responsibility for continuing a legacy of choosing love over fear, hope over despair, connection over division. As seasons passed and the immediate grief of Thomas's death gave way to celebration of his and Elena's enduring influence, their story settled into its permanent place in the ongoing human conversation about moral courage, individual responsibility, and the possibility of love transcending hatred. They had proven through their choices that ordinary people could create extraordinary beauty even in the darkest circumstances, that love was indeed stronger than fear when individuals possessed the courage to act on that belief. Their impossible romance had become possible inspiration. Their wartime survival had transformed into peacetime wisdom, and their personal happiness had evolved into universal hope for anyone facing circumstances that demanded choosing between fear and compassion, between self-interest and service to others, between the easy path of hatred and the difficult journey of love. Elena and Thomas had knocked on history's door as desperate strangers and entered as teachers whose lessons would influence generations they would never meet, in circumstances they could never imagine. Long after their voices had joined the chorus of those who had chosen love when the world offered every reason for despair. Their story would continue, carried forward by everyone who heard it and chose to believe that such love remained possible, such courage remained accessible, such hope remained reasonable, even in humanity's darkest hours. Years turned to decades, and Elena and Thomas's story continued rippling through communities they had never imagined reaching. Their great-grandchildren grew into young adults who carried their ancestors' wisdom into a world facing new forms of division and hatred. These young people found themselves navigating social media landscapes where anonymous cruelty flourished, political climates where compromise seemed impossible, and global challenges that required the kind of moral courage their great-grandparents had demonstrated during humanity's darkest chapter. One of their great-granddaughters, Sarah, became a documentary filmmaker specializing in stories of reconciliation across cultural divides. She traveled to regions scarred by contemporary conflicts, seeking individuals who had chosen compassion over vengeance, understanding over prejudice. In refugee camps along contested borders, she found people making choices remarkably similar to those Elena had faced when she opened her door to Thomas decades earlier. In Bosnia, Sarah interviewed a Muslim woman who had hidden her Serbian neighbor's children during ethnic cleansing campaigns, risking her own family's safety to protect those whom propaganda had labeled enemies. The woman spoke of sleepless nights, wondering if she was endangering her own children by sheltering others, echoing the moral complexity Elena had navigated when protecting Thomas meant potentially sacrificing her entire community's safety. In Rwanda, Sarah documented the story of a Tutsi survivor who had forgiven the Hutu neighbor who had participated in killing her family, choosing to work together on reconciliation projects rather than pursuing revenge. The survivor explained that hatred had already consumed too much of her country's future, that only love could break cycles of violence that threatened to destroy another generation. These contemporary stories revealed patterns that transcended specific historical moments or geographical locations. Across cultures and conflicts, certain individuals chose to see shared humanity rather than imposed differences, to extend mercy rather than demand justice, to build bridges rather than fortify walls. Sarah's documentaries captured these choices not as saintly exceptions, but as accessible possibilities available to anyone willing to risk comfort for conscience. Her work brought her to the attention of international peace organizations seeking to understand how reconciliation happened at individual levels before becoming possible at societal scales. Sarah found herself consulting on conflict resolution programs, sharing insights gained from studying her great-grandparents' story alongside dozens of similar accounts of love transcending hatred in impossible circumstances. The patterns she identified became the foundation for educational programs designed to help people recognize opportunities for choosing compassion in their own daily encounters with difference. These programs used Elena and Thomas's story as one example among many, demonstrating that moral courage was not limited to dramatic wartime circumstances, but could be practiced in routine interactions with neighbors, colleagues, and strangers who belonged to different communities. Meanwhile, Sarah's cousin Michael had become a pediatric psychiatrist specializing in treating children traumatized by violence and displacement. His gentle approach with young patients reflected his understanding of how trauma could be transmitted across generations, how healing required patience and consistent demonstration that the world contained sources of safety as well as danger. Michael's waiting room displayed photographs from around the world showing children at play, reminding his young patients that childhood joy existed even in places touched by conflict. Among these images was a photograph Thomas had taken of Elena teaching their daughter to tend roses in their American garden, capturing a moment of ordinary happiness that had emerged from extraordinary suffering. The Phi children. Michael treated often carried wounds invisible to casual observation. They flinched at unexpected sounds, struggled to trust adult promises of protection, and sometimes spoke of nightmares featuring shadowy figures who meant them harm. Michael recognized in these symptoms echoes of the anxiety his great-grandfather had described experiencing decades after the war ended, the hypervigilance that survived long after actual danger had passed. His treatment approach emphasized creating environments where children could experience safety without having their past trauma dismissed or minimized. He understood that healing required acknowledging what had been lost while nurturing hope for what remained possible. This balance reflected lessons passed down through family stories about how Elena and Thomas had honored their wartime losses while building meaningful lives focused on future possibility rather than past pain. Michael often found himself working with refugee children whose families had made desperate journeys seeking sanctuary in America. These young patients reminded him of the courage required not just for initial escape, but for the long process of adaptation that followed. He saw how children absorbed their parents' anxiety about acceptance, their uncertainty about whether this new country would prove truly welcoming or merely temporarily tolerant. Through his work, Michael discovered that healing from displacement trauma required more than individual therapy. Children needed to see their families thriving, their communities embracing them, their new society offering genuine opportunities for belonging. He began organizing community events where established families could meet newly arrived refugees, creating connections that helped both groups understand their shared hopes for children's futures. These gatherings often took place in the community center where Elena had once taught citizenship classes, the same building where Thomas's 80th birthday celebration had brought together people from dozens of countries. The continuity felt intentional, as though Elena and Thomas's legacy was actively shaping opportunities for new generations of displaced families to experience welcome rather than suspicion. The center's walls now displayed a permanent exhibition about immigration to their community over the past century. Elena and Thomas's story occupied one section, but visitors could also learn about Irish families fleeing famine, Italian workers seeking economic opportunity, Jewish refugees escaping persecution, Vietnamese boat people starting over after war, and contemporary arrivals from Syria, Somalia, and Central America. This historical perspective helped longtime residents understand that their community had always been shaped by people seeking better lives, that diversity was not a recent challenge but a long-standing source of strength. Children attending Michael's community events could see their own families, experiences reflected in stories spanning generations, understanding that successful integration was an ongoing American tradition rather than an unprecedented experiment. The exhibition also explored how each wave of immigration had initially faced resistance before ultimately being accepted as part of the community's identity. Irish Catholics had once been viewed with suspicion by Protestant neighbors. Italian workers had faced discrimination based on stereotypes about criminality and loyalty. Jewish refugees had encountered quotas and social barriers that limited their opportunities for advancement. Yet each group had eventually found ways to contribute to community life while maintaining connections to their heritage. The exhibition showed how diversity had strengthened rather than weakened social bonds, how different traditions had enriched rather than threatened local culture, how former strangers had become neighbors and eventually friends across lines that had once seemed impossible to cross. Sarah incorporated footage from the Community Center exhibition into her latest documentary project, which explored how Elena and Thomas's story continued influencing their hometown decades after their deaths. She interviewed former students who had become teachers themselves, passing along Thomas's emphasis on seeing complexity rather than seeking simple answers to difficult questions. One retired educator explained how Thomas's approach had shaped her teaching of American history, helping students understand that progress had always required individuals willing to challenge unjust systems even when such challenges carried personal costs. She described classroom discussions where students grappled with moral dilemmas faced by historical figures, learning to appreciate the courage required for choosing principles over popularity. Another former student had become a social worker specializing in family reunification services, helping relatives separated by immigration policies find each other and rebuild relationships interrupted by distance and time. She credited Thomas's example with teaching her that bureaucratic obstacles should never prevent compassionate action, that creative solutions could usually be found when people committed themselves to serving human needs rather than protecting institutional convenience. Sarah also interviewed community leaders who had worked alongside Elena in various volunteer organizations over the years. They described her quiet but persistent advocacy for policies that welcomed newcomers rather than merely tolerating their presence. Elena had understood that true integration required effort from established residents as well as arriving families, that successful communities actively created opportunities for connection rather than waiting for natural assimilation to occur. Her approach had involved practical assistance like job placement and language tutoring, but also social inclusion through shared activities that allowed people to discover common interests despite different backgrounds. Elena had organized cooking classes where women from various cultures taught each other traditional recipes, creating friendships that transcended language barriers and cultural unfamiliarity. These cooking classes had evolved into monthly international dinners that continued years after Elena's death, now organized by women whose families had once been recipients of her welcome. The dinners took place in church basements and community centers throughout the region, bringing together people who might otherwise never interact, despite living in the same neighborhoods. Sarah attended one of these dinners while filming her documentary, observing how naturally conversation flowed between families whose origins spanned 6 continents, but whose current concerns focused on shared challenges like raising teenagers, caring for aging parents, and finding meaning in work that often felt more routine than fulfilling. The evening reminded her of Sunday dinners at her great-grandparents' home, where multiple generations had gathered to discuss current events with the moral sophistication Elena and Thomas had modeled through their daily choices. These contemporary gatherings served similar functions, creating spaces where people could explore complex questions without fear of judgment or ridicule. During the dinner, Sarah interviewed a young mother from Somalia who had arrived in the community just 2 years earlier. The woman spoke about initial fears that her children would lose connection to their heritage while adapting to American culture, concerns that echoed Elena's own worries about maintaining identity while embracing new possibilities. But the woman had discovered, through participation in community activities started by Elena's example, that successful integration did not require abandoning cultural roots. Her children were learning English while maintaining fluency in their native language, participating in American traditions while observing religious practices from their homeland, making friends across ethnic lines while understanding their own family's unique history. This balance reflected lessons Elena and Thomas had modeled throughout their American lives, showing how people could honor their past while fully embracing their future, how diversity could strengthen rather than threaten community bonds when approached with intentional effort to create understanding across difference. The Somali mother's story became a central element in Sarah's documentary, illustrating how Elena and Thomas's legacy continued creating practical opportunities for newcomers to experience welcome rather than mere tolerance. The woman's successful integration demonstrated that their great-grandparents' approach remained relevant for contemporary challenges, that choosing compassion over fear continued producing positive outcomes for entire communities. As Sarah completed her documentary, she reflected on how her great-grandparents' impossible wartime romance had evolved into ongoing inspiration for people facing their own moral challenges. Their story provided not answers but examples, not rules but models, not certainty but hope that love could indeed transcend hatred when individuals possessed courage to act on that belief despite circumstances that offered every excuse for choosing otherwise. The documentary's premiere took place in the same theater where Elena and Thomas's original film had been shown decades earlier. 4 generations of their family attended, along with community members whose lives had been touched by their legacy in various ways. The audience included refugees who had been welcomed through programs inspired by Elena's example, students who had been taught by educators influenced by Thomas's approach, and young people who had grown up hearing their story as naturally as other children learned fairy tales about courage and kindness. As the credits rolled over images of the rose garden that still bloomed behind the community center, Sarah realized that her great-grandparents had achieved something beyond their wildest dreams during those desperate months of hiding. Their love had not only survived impossible circumstances, but had created a legacy that would influence people they would never meet in situations they could never imagine, long after their own voices had joined the chorus of those who had chosen hope when the world offered every reason for despair. The film's reception confirmed that their story continued resonating with audiences facing contemporary challenges that required similar moral courage. Reviews praised the documentary not for providing easy answers, but for honestly exploring how ordinary people could choose extraordinary compassion when circumstances demanded impossible decisions about loyalty, identity, and the meaning of home. Educational institutions began incorporating Sarah's film into curricula designed to help students understand both historical and contemporary immigration experiences. The documentary provided context for discussions about current refugee policies, community responses to diversity, and individual responsibilities for creating inclusive societies where everyone could contribute their talents while maintaining connections to their heritage. International film festivals selected the documentary for screenings focused on reconciliation and peace-building themes. Audiences in countries experiencing their own conflicts found relevance in Elena and Thomas's example of love transcending artificial boundaries created by politics and propaganda. Their story offered hope that individual choices for compassion could eventually influence broader social attitudes toward former enemies and current strangers. And so their story lives on, carried forward by every person who chooses to open their door to a stranger, who sees humanity in the face of fear, who believes that love can conquer even the darkest hatred. Elena and Thomas prove that in our most impossible moments we discover who we truly are. Their legacy reminds us that ordinary people can choose extraordinary courage, that hope survives when we dare to act with compassion, and that love indeed transcends every barrier when we find the strength to choose it over fear